Welcome, everybody, to our latest countdown. I have two special guests here with me. We have, firstly, Scrapbook Boxing. Welcome, my friend.
Yes, Random. How are you? BL, how's it going? I hope the audience is doing just as well.
Everything's
I'm very
great.
good, Scrapbook. Thank you.
Yes, the Boxing Librarian. We're back. Sorry about the technical difficulty. I just figured we'd start a new one. Hey, Martin, welcome to the stream. So we are counting down the lightweights. This was extremely difficult. I say that every time. It's true every time, but this was grueling. There's so many greats. BL, how rough is this division as far as trying to figure out who's who in this amazing bracket?
I had to leave out so many fighters who you can quantify as great fighters in the lightweight division. I had to leave so many of them out. And the stat I mentioned before was in my top 100 or my top 1,000 in my database. 19 of the fighters in the top 100 are lightweights. So if you consider even going by original 8 divisions and even factoring that some fighters in my top 100 are not solely lightweights, that is a huge percentage of that top 100 that actually fought quite an amount within the lightweight class. So I think it is one of great crossover divisions, but a division that has spawned many, many, many great fighters across history.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't sure. So my list is like a series of shout outs. I don't think I'm qualified to choose between all these great fighters.
Random, you're breaking up now, buddy.
Yeah, you sound like a robot. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Was that any better?
Might be your location.
Still broken up. Scrapbook's fine now to me.
Okay, hold on a second. Did that get any better then?
Yeah, you're still breaking up a little bit there.
Starting, if you guys are clear, who's starting?
I can start right now.
Go for it.
Well, 1855, when boxing began in 1681, you didn't have a specific lightweight until 1855, and that was John Monahan. He was an Irishman from Liverpool, England, and he came to America and he took claim to that title, December 18th, 1855, when he defeated Jim Hart. 45 rounds and 51 seconds. Until then, you didn't have a specific division called lightweight. So from that point on, you have lightweights all the way up into current time. So it was very difficult to choose a specific lightweight for this conversation, but I did choose my number 10, and it's Bojack Sidney Walker. I call him the punching shoeshine boy. He was born April 1st, 1921 in West Georgia, and he died February 9, 2000 in Miami Beach, Florida. He was 78 years of age at the time of his death, and he's 5'6". He was a lightweight with a 68-inch reach. I had the pleasure of meeting him, and he was an outstanding humanitarian, but a hell of a fighter. He had a record of 121 total bouts, 91 wins, 44 knockouts, 24 losses, and 5 draws with 1 no contest. April 7th, 1931, August 12th, 1955 were the years of his performances. December 18th, 1942 to November 19th, 1943, he was the champion. He had a grandmother who actually beat him for not standing up for himself. And once he learned the hard way, he took that out on Ali Stokes, Ike Williams, and many, many other great fighters. 1943, he was in a ring with Henry Armstrong. And for Bojack, that was quite touching because Henry Armstrong became his mentor and began teaching him how to fight low. And it turns out he had to wind up fighting him. But I think, in my opinion, the greatest lightweight fight that I've ever seen, at least on television, was when he fought Ike Williams in 1948 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That was a hell of a fight. So I have Bojack as my number 10 greatest lightweight. I'm cutting it short because we lost some time, but great fighter was Bojack.
Oh, fantastic. BL, would you like to present your number 10, sir?
Yes, I would indeed. My number 10 is actually a fighter called Saverio Mandala. Okay, and it's great. There could be some differences on our countdowns on this one for sure. Yeah, Saverio Mandala, of course, known as Sammy Mandel, a Jewish fighter a fantastic lightweight. One of the favourites, of course, of Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was a big fan of Sammy Mandel, and rates him highly after watching all those old films in Jim Jacobs and Caton's, well, more Caton's film collection. Sammy Mandel is an underrated lightweight fighter all time for me. You know, whether it's fighting and beating fighters like Memphis Palmore or former super bantamweight champion Jack Kid Wolf, fighting tough contenders, okay, like Joey Sangor, Cowboy Eddie Anderson. He actually fought one of the tougher lightweight resumes, you know, Jack Bernstein's, everybody, Johnny Dundee's. So ultimately, you're looking at a fighter in Sammy Mandel who was a legitimate world champion. He had a number of world title fights in his career. Amongst the lightweights, I do think, like I said, he does get a bit underrated. He beat 9 individual world champions in his career, and Sammy Mandel beat 8 individual Hall of Fame fighters, which is a huge tally that in Hall of Famers beat and puts him right up there, just below fighters like, you know, Tony Canzoneri and fighters like that. He also had 6 world title fights, only lost 1 of them, and made a number of title defenses. I'll cut my number 10 short as well, but yeah, Sammy Mandel, definitely a great fighter, one of the great fighters of that period, goes a bit underrated. On his blue screen video on my channel, it is crossing over into the rating era, so it's not a full representation of what he did, but he was a great fighter for sure.
Wow, that's excellent. Is my audio better now?
Perfect.
Much better.
Okay.
Great breakdown, BL.
Yeah, that was
Thank you,
excellent. Okay, so for my number 10 shout out, my number 10 list, I want to give some praise to the great Jack Blackburn. Jack Blackburn, wow. Hall of Fame coach, not in the Hall of Fame as a fighter, but he was one of the great stylists of the early 1900s. He was the man who snapped the great Joe Gann's epic win streak. And he also, that same year, he clearly got the best of the great Sam Langford shortly after Langford had beaten Joe Gans in a longer fight, in a 15-round fight, which was considered much more definitive. But Jack Blackburn also beat Dave Hawley, Sam Boland, George Cole, Jim Barry, Harry Lewis. But he also very influential stylistically and was considered one of the great lightweights of that rich era. And getting the best of great fighters like Joe Gans, Sam Langford, Dave Hawley, that burst when he was at lightweight before he was moving up, as many fighters did as they got older. But just incredible. So I wanted to give a shout to the great Jack Blackburn.
Oh, great fighter he was. Great fighter. I want to talk about number 9. Number 9, I have Willie Joyce. Willie Joyce was an outstanding, underrated fighter, in my opinion. He won a 1936 National AAU Bantamweight Championship, and in 1937 Chicago Inner City Golden Gloves. I mean, there's so many things I can tell you about Willie Joyce. I'll just cut it short. Willie Joyce had faced former lightweight champion Lou Jenkins 3 times in Chicago in 1939, 1 draw and 2 wins. It was at the White Arena. He was in a ring with Hammer and Henry Armstrong 4 times, 1943 and 1944. Joyce defeated Henry Armstrong at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. He lost to Henry Armstrong at Gilmore Stadium in Los Angeles. He defeated Henry Armstrong at Chicago Stadium. And then he lost to him one more time at Civic Auditorium in San Francisco. He would face the future featherweight champion Torquay Wright from 1945. And he faced the future champion at Comiskey Park in Chicago, Willie Pepper, in Connecticut. But the thrilling highlights of Willie Joyce's career was his 4 fights with Ike Williams between 1944 and 1945. He defeated future current world NBA lightweight and New York lightweight champion Ike Williams 3 out of 4 times. And that was remarkable. So when you look at fighters like that, didn't necessarily have to be a champion, but his competitiveness is what gives me the food process to think about a fighter like him. And that's all it takes, is what you show in the ring, the fights that you want to challenge yourself with, not necessarily be a champion. So Willie Joyce is my pick for number 9.
Excellent.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there? Yeah, great choice, Scrapbook. Willie Joyce. As Scrapbook knows, I rate Willie Joyce very highly. I mean, the guy had 8 wins against Hall of Fame fighters, and he was featured on my Should Be in the Hall of Fame series. He had 5 wins over pound-for-pound #1 rated fighters in my pound-for-pound rankings. So we're talking about a major league fighter who also had nearly 4 dozen fights against top 10 contenders. I mean, he's a major fighter, and Scrapbook alluded to fights with Ike Williams. He also, of course, took part in a little fight run with Henry Armstrong, of course, Willie Joyce. So we're talking about a real top-level operator. And some people give him the praise of being the 4th greatest lightweight of that era behind Williams, Jack, and Montgomery. But as Scrapbook alluded to, it wasn't that he was necessarily below them. Maybe he just didn't achieve the title heights that they achieved. But in terms of a competitor, he was pretty much on a fair par with them. He could compete with them and beat them. You know, he was capable of competing or beating them. He is that great a fighter and goes very underrated. I see Willie Joyce as a Jimmy Bivins type fighter, an outrageously talented fighter, teak tough, capable of beating Hall of Famers, but just goes under the radar for some bizarre reason, just like fighters like Jimmy Bivins do, Billy Patrol, other fighters. So great choice by Scrapbook for sure.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you.
That brings us to your number 9, BL.
Well, my number 9, I had a heavy heart putting him number 9. I rate this guy massively. Okay, he didn't start winning a lightweight title. He actually started winning a light welterweight title, and Scrapbook's probably already nailed it. He then went on to be 2-time undisputed lightweight champion. To me, the great Puerto Rican fighter Carlos Ortiz is just that, a great fighter. Carlos Ortiz had a shorter career, okay, than some fighters on this top 10. Okay, so, you know, he only had 13 fights against Hall of Famers. I say it only 13, you know, and Floyd Mayweather's currently on 5. He also had a title run of 18 fights, okay, with 11 title defenses. You know, 15 of those were undisputed title fights. Carlos Ortiz, to me, when you factor that with his resume, you know, the fights with Duilio Lois, you know, the fights with another outrageously good fighter who goes very under radar, at lightweight, Ishmael Laguna, who were another really, really good fighter. I think Carlos Ortiz is rated by some and not rated by others, but I think he's a legitimate top 10 lightweight. I really would find it hard to stress why people wouldn't have him in the top 10. He's just a great fighter all round. And he actually, you know, competed at such a level in fighting top level opposition, and his winning records against them. You know, the fact he was like rated top 3 every single year he was rated, more than a decade worth. So he was rated more than a decade by Ring, and every year he went in top 3, whether that be first, second, or third, consistent every single year he was rated. That shows how highly they regarded him, and his opponents regarded him just as highly. Very, very good fighter. He, like Willie Joyce, had 8 wins against Hall of Famers. He beat 5 world champions in a much shorter career than some others. You know, like Sammy Mandel has those great wins over fighters like Kansas and Fields and McLaren and Canzoneri. But to me, Carlos Ortiz has a greater title record than Mandel, even though Mandel, to me, probably may have the overall better resume with some of them legendary wins he's got on there. But yeah, I think Carlos Ortiz is definitely up in the top lightweights company for sure, due to his great resume, his great title record. Being a 3-time undisputed champion is no slouch. And yeah, he carved his own little legend, and we lost him more recently in time. And I'll just say RIP, champ, and thank you for everything you did for the sport.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing on Carlos Ortiz. Great selection, BL. I knew Carlos Ortiz very well. He was a taxi cab driver in the Bronx, New York, when he ended his career. But he came back to the gym, Gleason's Gym, when it's located on 75 Front Street in Brooklyn. And he was training. The last fighter he trained was a fighter by the name of Stefan Johnson, good friend of mine. Stefan Johnson would die in the ring when he faced Paul Beaton. But Carlos Ortiz used to train him, and I would watch how he trained Stefan Johnson. He was a mastermind. I used to watch him when he trained himself. He done with his career in Gleason's Gym when it was on 30th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan before it moved to Brooklyn. And he was still training around, but he was done with boxing by then. He always sweat up a storm, gave it everything he had. It was a pleasure to speak with and a pleasure to watch train fighters. So I just wanted to give him that little homage, but great conversation on Carlos Ortiz. Yeah.
Scrapbook, you have been in a gym watching Carlos Ortiz train a fighter.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. Yeah, he had an
Wow.
office right next to Bob Jackson, and that was when you first walked into the gym. He had an office, then you had Bob Jackson, and then you also had another trainer. Al Gavin was the assistant. He was the cut man to Bob Jackson, but then you had Hector Looker. So those are the four guys who was training. Then you had Teddy Alice, of course, and Edwin Verrett. Those are the trainers in Gleason's gym. But Carlos Ortiz had his own office when he came back. Beautiful, beautiful humanitarian.
Wow, that is incredible, Scrap. Really incredible. You know, I love these stories you tell because your experience in this sport is so vast. I love listening to it. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I'm such an audience over here. I'm supposed to be participating, but I'm just loving soaking this up. I struggled with the order of my list. I actually ended up with Ortiz here, but it's, I'm fairly confused, but I did try to sort of look at the lineage of all the champs and then when the belts all branched out, what was going where, but this man definitely stands out. I don't know if I'd have him here a couple places higher, but I'm going to put Ortiz right here and just send it right on to Scrap for his number 8. But what a great pair of tributes that was, guys. Thank you. Do all of mine for me.
Absolutely. BL is going to like this one because this man fought a fighter that we talked about behind the scenes in 1920. And I'll mention that man's name when I get to him. But the fighter I'm referring to, Freddie Welch. Freddie Welch was an outstanding fighter. He really, really was. I think he's underrated, in my opinion. He was born March 5th, 1886 in Wales. And he died in New York in 1927. But he fought fighters such as Abe Patel and Leach Cross, who were fighting Dennis. You had Ed Wargat, Matt Wells. You had Charlie White, a fantastic fighter from Chicago was Charlie White. Beautiful fighter. You had, like I said, Leach Cross. You had Willie Ray and Ray Bronson, Mexican Joe Rivers, just to name a few. But he won a British lightweight championship November 8th, 1909, when he defeated Johnny Summers. Then he won the European lightweight championship December 20th, 1910, when he defeated Jim Driscoll. Then he, between February 27th, 1911 and November 11th, 1912, he took on the British lightweight crown with Matt Wells, and he lost that title, unfortunately, but he would regain it July 7th, 1914. But when he took on Willie Ritchie, and he would become considered as world lightweight champion. May 28th, 1917, he would lose the crown to Benny Leonard, New York, in 9 rounds. But that was quite a run. But 1920, he fought Willie Green, BL. And he's the man we were talking about behind the scenes. But great fighter was Freddie Welch.
Yeah, that's incredible, Scrap. Incredible. I'm going to get onto Welsh when I get to him, but yeah, that were great. That were great.
Yeah, so I think we're down to great tribute. Yeah, so we're on to your number 8, BL.
Right, my number 8. Okay, my number 8, okay, is a fighter called Salvatore Angot, otherwise known as the Clutch, Sammy Angot. Now, the Clutch is one of my favorite nicknames in boxing, the Clutch. Okay, he had a hit, grab, tie up, befuzzle your style. Fantastically tough fighter to be. You know, in his 29 career defeats, this is an interesting little statoid for people out there. Scrapbook mentioned a fighter called Bo Jack, the swarming aggressive Bo Jack, and you know, the only fighter to stop Sammy Angot in 29 professional fights was actually Bo Jack. That's just an interesting little thing. But no one else could stop him. You know, Ike Williams couldn't stop him. You know, none of them could stop him. Henry Armstrong couldn't stop him, but Bo Jack could. Kind of shows you Bo Jack's quality. But, you know, Sammy Angot, to me, again, is a very, very underrated fighter. Sammy Angot, I've prattled about for years on YouTube. You know, he beat 8 Hall of Famers again, okay? He had nearly a dozen wins against Hall of Famers. Didn't have the biggest title fight record, okay, but had nearing 70 fights against top 10 fighters. He also ended the first unbeaten run of the great Willie Pep himself. Willie Pep were he 63-0, 64-0? Sammy Angot beat him. He was the first fighter to beat Willie Pep. And after Willie Pep lost that fight, he didn't lose again for well over 130 fights. So in total on his career. So Sammy Ango was the only fighter to beat Willie Pep in over 130 fights. He was only stopped once in his career. Very difficult fighter to fight and beat when he was on his day. Now, Sammy Ango, he fought like a who's who of the top fighters of his time. He really did. Whether it's beating really tough contenders like Everett Reitmeyer, he had like 10 defeats, I think, in over 100 fights. He beat unbeaten Pete Lello, who was a very good contender. He beat Wesley Ramey. You know, he lost and won to Leo Rodak, who is a fighter that I constantly go on about. Leo Rodak, a super tough contender, brief champion, courtesy of a belt being awarded to him. But he also beat one of great featherweight kings, Freddie Miller. Okay, so Sammy Ango, not only in beating Willie Pep, he's also beating Freddie Miller. He's also beaten another former featherweight champion who Armstrong won his first title against, Peter Cerrone. And he's also beaten one of the undersung Mexican great fighters, Baby Arizmendi. Okay, he's also multiple times beat David Day. The reason I'm doing it this way is I'm really trying to highlight to you the fighters this guy beat. He lost to Ray Robinson, of course, 3 times. He also beat the excellent, outstanding great lightweight, the Bobcat Bon Montgomery. And he also beat Lou Jenkins, tied to beating Willie Pep and fighting Henry Armstrong 3 times. He also beat super tough contender Luther Slugger White, who were one of outstanding lightweight contenders at that time. Also fought fighters like Juan Zarita. Just on and on and on. You go through this guy's resume and it is like a who's who. And even in later years of his career, fighting and beating fighters like Johnny Bratton. You know, this guy was a major, major fighter, an outstanding fighter. You know, I think it were what it is in his last 5 fights. I think he still had enough about him to beat Kid Azteca. So, you know, we're talking about, to me, a legitimate top 10 all-time great lightweight. He one of the first names that went into my pool, along with certain other names I'll get to on my countdown. But I put him in mind. I think he does go very underrated at lightweight, does Sammy Ango. For sure. The clutch, like I said, that is one of my favorite nicknames because he would attack and then tie you up. He'd try and frustrate you, tie you up so you couldn't get shots off at him, but he'd always try and get his shot in first, then close distance. Very, very tough fighter. And against Willie Pep, it worked. You know, Willie Pep didn't solve the puzzle and got beat. Great, great fighter.
Yeah, BL, I just want to say, you mentioned a fighter that Henry Armstrong took his featherweight championship from, which was, like you're right, Peter Cerrone. And Peter Cerrone retired after his fight with Angot. It goes to show you the kind of fighter that Sammy Angot really was. And what he did with Willie Pepin, he was just a magnificent fighter. The clutch is a great name for him, and that was a great selection you chose for him.
Yeah, thank you, Scrapbook. I know that Bojack, he dropped him, you know, because didn't Ango pull an excuse that he had cramp in his stomach or his leg or something, but actually Bojack absolutely wiped him, dropped him multiple times, if I recall, from when I researched it. Yeah, Bojack did a real number on him, showing how good Bojack could be. But yeah, Sammy Ango's a great fighter. Thank you for that, Scrap.
Absolutely.
Phenomenal. Okay, so we have no rules criteria. So I'm going to do a double-barreled number. What are we on? Number 8, is it? Yeah, so it's a double-barrel shout-out here for different reasons, but great stylists that I just feel both could get mentioned, but I'm not sure. There's so many guys to fit in, so I'm going to break the rules. The first of the two, Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker. I didn't know if he was going to make anyone's list because he had a shorter career, but he was a brilliant stylist. And still to this day, just known as a sort of a genius boxer. And if you can stay in the among the top group of names for that long, there's a good reason for it. The other stylist I wanted to shout out was the loop-de-loop puncher, Dave Hawley, who fought many generations before that. He debuted, I think it was actually January 1st, 1900. This guy had a tremendous schedule, although he got injured. I think it was in 1905. Got injured in a head clash, and then later he got Scrapbook had mentioned he got bit by a dog and passed away. But he fit a lot of fighting in there, especially up to that point where he'd gotten injured. He did come back, but he gave, Sam Langford his second loss at a time when a lot of great fighters weren't giving Sam Langford losses. I believe he gave Jack Blackburn his first loss, at least recorded loss. Jack Blackburn reportedly had fights that weren't on the thing. He used sort of like a forerunner of the shoulder roll. He could fight out of a crouch, coming forward, going backwards, two-handed. The loop-de-loop punch, which I'm not sure, Bale, is that like a corkscrew punch? I mean, we have all these different names. You have Stanley Catchell's left shift. You've got, what did Langford call it, the piston punch or something like that. You know, everyone.
Yeah, Dave Holly was known as the loop-a-loop punch. I did the loop-a-loop punch.
Right. Scrapbook mentioned Larry Temple, the Bolo punch, and just so I wanted to give both those guys shout outs for just being very influential in their own ways. And Dave Holly is not celebrated like Whitaker. He didn't have the title success of Whitaker, but they're both fantastic in their own right. They're both definitely people who are advancing the science, the sweet science. So that brings us back to Scrapbook now.
Yeah, that was a great tribute there, Random. Yeah, Charles Kidd McCoy, he invented the corkscrew punch. That's a very, very, it was somewhat with Stanley Ketchel, somewhat, he would do the shift. But my number 7 is Sammy Mindell. I think, misunderstood when you look at boxing historically. Sammy Mindell has a long run of, great fighters, but he defeated such men as a Tony Canzoneri and Jimmy McLaurin and Jack Bernstein, Rocky Kansas, Sid Terrace, Jack Zivic. I mean, he was in the ring with everybody. So when you look at a fighter like that, you have to look at him and see what era he came from, what men were around during his time, what was happening during his and you can kind of package it all in and see what kind of a fighter he was. I mean, Johnny Dundee and Jackie Kid Wolf, Jack Bernstein, just a few names that he was in the ring with. And he fought, for a long time. Well, he fought Rocky Kansas in 1926. And 1930, he was in the ring with a fighter by the name of Al Singer. And Al Singer would knock out Sammy Mindell, and 6 months later, Tony Canzoneri would knock him out. And I just thought it was, during that time, you had a really good run of fighters. And Sammy Mindell, he fits right into it. So I have to say Sammy Mindell was my number 7 fighter on the list.
Yeah, great choice, Scrapbook. He is very underrated, Sammy Mindell.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now we're on your number 7, I think, BL?
Yeah, my number 7. My number 7 is actually a fighter that Scrapbook has mentioned, okay? And it is the Welsh wizard, Freddie Welsh. One of my favourite UK fighters. I actually rate Freddie Welsh. This is controversial to some, but I rate Freddie Welsh the greatest Welsh fighter of all time over Jimmy Wilde, because I think Freddie Welsh, in terms of his resume, overall, he's not a mighty as puncher as Jimmy Wilde, but I think his resume is overall better than Jimmy Wilde's. I don't think Jimmy Wilde has a better name than the current featherweight king Abe Attell in 1908, like Freddie Welsh has. And Freddie Welsh, he turned pro about 1905, 1904, 1905. By 1908, he's beating a fighter like Abe Attell, who was the current reigning lineal featherweight champion of the world and had been for a whole number of years. He would later lose it to Kilbane. But to even beat a fighter like, Abe Attell, even early on in his career, and then go on to be world lightweight champion. Yeah, he wasn't world lightweight champion for too long, but like Scrapbook alluded to earlier, he's fighting and beating Abe Attell. He's beating Jim Driscoll, tough contenders, Philadelphia Palmore, Matty Baldwin, even beating Willie Ritchie, okay, with a decent puncher, Lockport Jimmy Duffy. Many of these fighters, when you look at a resume like Freddie Welsh and you see these fighters like Lockport Jimmy Duffy and Philadelphia Palmore and Matt Wells, when you add that to the other bigger names to be, like Johnny Dundee, and beating really, really good fighters like Joe Mandot, beating former champions like Ad Walgast, the outstanding great UK fighter Charlie White, who to me should be a definite Hall of Famer and should also be more credited on all-time UK boxing lists. To me, Freddie Welsh fought in a great era filled with some of the greatest fighters from 1905 to 1925 around that division, and he fought a whole number of them and acquitted himself well. He beat a whole pile of Hall of Famers himself in number, beating 6 Hall of Famers. He beat 7 world champions, which doesn't sound a lot compared to now, but we have to remember that when Freddie Welsh turned pro, the official flyweight division had not been installed yet. Okay, so Jimmy Wilde had not become the first lineal flyweight champion yet. This were a decade before that Freddie Welsh turned professional. There was no super bantamweight and super featherweight for a short time like there was in the 1920s. So, even beating 7 world champions and having severe winning records against the champions and Hall of Famers he fought and pound-pounders he fought coupled with that incredible resume filled with some of those really, really tough contenders. Because even fighters like Johnny Griffiths, you know, were not easy fighters to fight. You know, many of these guys were really tough. Many of them were battle hardened and experienced with dozens of fights. He, of course, later would fight the great Benny Leonard himself, the Ghetto Wizard, who I'm sure we will all get to on our countdowns. So he mixed in great company. He beat great names, you know, as well as Abe Attell, one great featherweight king. He also fought another great featherweight champion later, but lost Johnny Kilbane. And he just has a great resume all round. He just has a great resume. And to me, he's a legit top 10 UK fighter all time, greatest Welsh fighter of all time. Yeah, Freddie Welsh is my number 7.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm going to agree with you. I'm going with Welsh at number 7. I'm not going to try and outdo what you just dropped. That was fantastic. So everything you just said, yeah, I definitely agree. Ridiculous resume, like you said. You know, opponents like, you know, Walgas, Natel, Mandot, Charlie White, Dundee, just absolutely insane resume. Very accomplished. Beating 6 Hall of Famers, 7 champs. You said it's
Yeah, 6 Hall of Famers, 7 champions. Yeah,
there
he had
aren't
4
that
world
many
title
champs.
fights. Were
Right, there
lineal
aren't.
undisputed champion.
Goodness me, there aren't that many belts going around at this time. You have like a few divisions, and then you have some color belts at times, but it's not like today where you have all these weights. I don't know how many weight classes are there now for the men's divisions. Do you know?
Jimmy is 17 now, currently, yeah.
Right, so a fraction of that at this time.
Yeah.
So you can kind of multiply it out, but it's hard to get out a belt. There's some great fighters that you guys have done content on your channels who didn't even get a title shot, let alone, you know, fight for a title and possibly lose. I mean, it's just different, certain eras, especially the earlier eras here. Some of these schedules are absolutely ridiculous, packed in big fights.
Scrapbook will really get me on this. You know, a lot of people now look at these old boxers' records. They don't understand. They look for the big names. Oh, he fought Attell, he fought Kilbane, he fought Benny Leonard. But when you actually look at the resume of a guy like this, the Joe Shugrews, the Joe Mandos, the Lockport Jimmy Duffys, you know, the Willie Riches, the Charlie Whites, multiple fights against some of these guys. These guys were really, really tough fighters, you know. And when you fought those more marquee names, the now Hall of Famers, who weren't Hall of Famers in the time, but have since been enshrined and left these incredible legacies, like, you know, Attell and Kilbane, 2 of his opponents. There were lineal undisputed champion for nearly a quarter of a century between them, you know, down at featherweight. And then he's fought great lightweights like Benny Leonard and all these other fighters, you know. But many people gravitate to that, but they don't realize that a lot of the other fighters he fought that we mentioned, you know, are really, really tough fighters who are capable on the day of beating what we now call Hall of Fame fighters. You know, and he fought a whole pile of them. His resume is very tough, and that's why I rate him over Jimmy Wilde. Jimmy Wilde were a great puncher. He were a freak of nature. But to me, Freddie Welsh, with that resume, that's why I rate Freddie Welsh above Jimmy Wilde. I give him the credit of being the greatest Welsh fighter of all time.
Fantastic. So that brings us very much. So Scrap, we're now at your number 6, sir.
Absolutely. That was a great choice. Great choice. My number 6. Now, here's the thing, Random. You mentioned Colonel C.P. Whitaker. And I'm glad you put him in there because I had him as well. But you know what? Since he's already on the list, I want to add Bobby Dobbs. Bobby Dobbs was a colored lightweight champion, and he was a phenomenal fighter. He fought guys like George Cole. He fought young Peter Jackson 3 times, a 20-round victory. I just want you to take a look at this. George Kid Lavin, Dan Creedon, Andy Watson, Joe Walcott, Joe Gans. He defeated Joe Gans, and he lost to him twice. But Joe Gans challenged him for his colored lightweight championship title, and he lost. And that's a thing to really take a look at because Joe Gans was a heavy-handed puncher, and he had the ability to make you do things you didn't want to do to set you up for your own default. And Bobby Dobbs understood that back then. He fought Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, had a draw with him. Phil Jack O'Brien, as we know, was a light heavyweight champion, lost his title to Jack Dillon. But the thing about Bobby Dobbs, a lot of people just don't rate him where he should be rated. And I think he should be rated very decent because he came around at a time where it wasn't easy for him, but at the same time, he hung out with them guys. He hung out with Joe Gans and Joe Walcott and George Cole. When I say hung out with him, I mean he could stand in the ring and beat him at any given time. So I have him in that selection of number 6.
Oh, very good. BL.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just a second. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, Bobby Dobbs, very tough fighter. Beat Joe Gans to win over Joe Gans, as Scrapbook mentioned. A lot of endurance. Very, very tough fighter to beat. He would a bit like a Sam McVeigh, not in terms of punching or his fighting style, but in terms of generally, if you got in a ring with him, you had a difficult night on your hands. You know, he was a very, very experienced fighter. Fought who's who of really tough fighters in his time that he doesn't get much credit for. I recently, over the last number of months, I did a little short on Bobby Dobbs. I think he's very underrated as a fighter. I think that's a very good shout to get his name mentioned, Scrapbook, because a lot of these fighters back then, you know, people don't understand them. And, you know, the more they learn about Bobby Dobbs, the more they appreciate Joe Gans, you know, the more, etc., etc. So, yeah, very, very good fighter indeed, from 1890s into 1900s for sure.
Oh, great pick now, BL.
That's a fantastic shout out.
It's so my number 6 now, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Well, my number 6 is actually a fighter called Old Bones. Okay. Some people may not realize when Duran set his title defense record, you know, at lightweight of 12 title defenses, the fighter's record he actually broke was Joe Old Bones Brown, who prior to Roberto Duran was the record holder for most lightweight title defenses at 11. And of course, Duran beat him when he beat De Jesus in that third fight to become undisputed champion. Now, what, you know, him and Duran have a similar title fight number, but the problem is Joe Brown fought, to me, better opposition overall in his title reign than Duran, and he was fighting pretty much for the undisputed title over Roberto Duran. So to me, that's why I actually rate Joe Brown very highly. You know, in his time, which was a very tough period, he actually had the ability to set a record in lightweight title defenses, which when you consider the fighters who came before him, you know, is quite a testament to him. It's something that he set, and that record stood. You know, he had a huge fight career, you know, approaching 190-ish fights. Just a massive career. He scored over 50 knockouts. He was one of that member in that 50-plus knockout club. And he had a number of defeats, but one of the things about Joe Brown is he's a bit like a chalky Wright. He's a bit like other fighters you look at when you look at the career. They start out a bit rough. Okay, they suffer a number of defeats, they're suffering draws, they're gaining odd wins. And then as you go through the career, you can see where, as they build experience, you know, they start to be able to beat better fighters, you know, and that's something that goes very unsung. You know, people who criticize a fight like Joe Brown for the number of defeats he had, but not realized he built that record in the boiler room. He started in boiler room. He wasn't playing five-a-side soccer in the park. He was in a boiler room smashing anvils all day, you know, compared to some fighters now who have 15, 20, 25 fights. They haven't even fought a top 10 level fighter yet. You know, they're carefully matched. Some fighters like Joe Brown and Chalky Wright down at featherweight, they were matched fairly tough early on and built experience and became very difficult to beat fighters. You know, Joe Brown fought Sandy Sadler, okay, 6 years in. That's probably his first major opponent of note. Sadler got rid of him real quick. But fighting up all through those fighters, fighting guys like Freddie Dawson, you know, and John L. Davis, who were actually a very good contender. John L. Davis, he was top 3 rated around that time. And even fighting other tough contenders like Tommy Campbell, who Scrapbook will be aware of, you know, and then jumping to fights like Virgil Atkins, who is a sensational fighter, Virgil Atkins. So basically, you know, he built his experience that way, became a legitimate champion, you know, for many good level contenders like Orlando Zulueta, gaining wins like that. Went into his title reign, and like I said, he developed to that point where he was a very difficult fighter to beat. And he left that lightweight title record. You know, he beat Wally Spud Smith twice. Wally Spud Smith is a very, very underrated fighter, a very, very good fighter indeed. Even defending his title against fighters like Joey Lopez and beating the sensational Kenny Lane, who I more recently did a video on in my recent blue screens. Kenny Lane, who were a pound-for-pound rated fighter who beat Hall of Famers himself and had an outstanding record. You know, beating Paolo Rossi, another top contender, and beating the Dartford Destroyer, the southpaw Dave Shanley. You know, so he mixed in very, very good company in his title reign, but he'd become a very, very hard to beat fighter. You know, and the company he mixed in, even later losing to Carlos Ortiz and fighters like that, he'd already kind of wrote his legend in. But to me, old Bones Joe Brown, tongue-tied, he was a trendsetter. He's setting that record, lightweight record that stood, you know, for a number of years before Roberto Duran finally beat it. But outstanding fighter, a rough piece of coal that were molded over those early defeats, those early draws, that tough matching into a bit of a diamond, okay? And he reigned as champion for a number of years. Very hard to beat fighter, very, very good lightweight fighter, very strong, durable, good puncher. Very hard fighter to be, very, very great lightweight indeed. So yeah, I picked Joe Brown's number 6. Sorry, I'm prattling a bit. I just get excited talking about these fighters. Yeah, Joe Brown's my number 6.
Oh, that's a great shout. Yeah, that's that title. We're thinking along the same lines, BL. That title dominance that stood for a long time. That counts for something. Just like with Joe Louis at heavyweight, there's a reason he's still celebrated. That level of dominance, you know, is pretty stunning. So I have him in the same spot. I'm not going to try and go into him any more than you have, but yeah, that's good. Give him a double-barreled shout out, which gets us to our top 5. This is critical, and I've already left out so many fighters. I'm like, I don't know how to backpedal.
My top 5's a heavy bunch, I'll just say.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Scrap, you're going to lead us off the round of 5.
Well, the reason why I'm not bringing up Joe Brown is because BL did, and I want Joe Brown on the list, and I'm satisfied that he's there. And that was a great selection. And when you mentioned Joe Brown, BL, very interesting. 1951, in my opinion, is one of the most upsetting years in boxing history, and Joe Brown is no exception. He took on, as you mentioned, Tommy Campbell, who was known as the Chocolate Ice Cube. He was out of California. And no one thought that this would happen because Joe Brown was trying to get himself back together, but he lost to Tommy Campbell. And Tommy Campbell was very, very underrated, but he was a very strong and hard puncher. But Joe Brown would lose to Tommy Campbell, and that was an upset in California. So that was a good shout out to Tommy Campbell. But Joe Brown was an unbelievable fighter. I mean, 12 title defenses, of course, Duran broke it. But the men that Joe Brown was in a ring with is undeniably. So that was a great selection. I want to choose for the next fighter is Roberto Duran. And the reason why I don't have him high is because the men are ahead of him. But Roberto Duran was something else, man. He was in a ring with fighters such as Ray Lampkin, Edwin Viruet. I knew Edwin Viruet very well out of Gleason's Gym. He used to train Glit with the Real Beast Brown. And he also trained a heavyweight. Can't think of his name now, it just slips me. But he was 20-0 with 24 knockouts when he went in the ring with Evander Holyfield. Can't think of his name now. But he trained him, and he trained Glenn with the Real Beast Brown, the Edwin Viruet. He had a brother by the name of Adolfo Viruet. But he fought Edwin Viruet, Kirkland Lane, Davey Moore. Had a pleasure being at that fight. He fought Ray Leonard, gave him his first loss. He was in a ring with Tommy Hearns, who suffered a brutal knockout in the second round. And that was for a vacant title. So he was in there with some of the greatest fighters during his era. So I placed him in there, but I placed him number 5 as opposed to a little bit higher because of, like I said, the men that are ahead of him. Great fighter was Roberto Duran. I have a problem with the no mas, but man, a great fighter up until that point. But he did some great things after that. I saw him when he fought Rand Barkley in Atlantic City. That was amazing. And he won the WBC middleweight championship crown that Ivan Barkley had defeated Thomas Hearns with. So that was a great fighter, was Roberto Duran.
Yeah, it's interesting, Scrat, you put him at number 5 because I've got him in mind. I considered dropping him a little bit. I've left him. I decided to leave him where he was, but yeah, it's interesting that. Yeah, interesting. I kind of had a symmetry with you, but I just stuck to where I had it, but I was considering dropping him 1 or 2. But yeah, it's interesting that, yeah. Right, well, from that great choice there, Roberto Duran, who I'll talk about him more when I get onto him, but he was actually a very clever fighter, much more clever than people will give him credit for. But my number 5, okay, has to be, okay, Tony Canzoneri. Now, if Canzoneri had done more of his work at lightweight, I would have him higher instantly. Okay, Tony Canzoneri would be top 3 instantly. Okay, but I have to accept when I was looking at it that he did fight a lot down at bantamweight against fighters like Charles Bud Taylor, who would also fight at featherweight. You know, and he also fought a number of other divisions going up. But Tony Canzoneri, to me, is just an all-time great fighter all round. He also, like Ango, only suffered 1 stoppage loss in his career. And if I recall, that was in his last professional fight against Al Bummy Davis, who were a good contender. And that was the only stoppage Tony Canzoneri suffered in his entire career. Now, he, of course, fought for the featherweight title, okay, but he then also went on later and captured lightweight and light welterweight titles. He's a 3-weight world champion, and he did do quite an amount of work at lightweight, not as much as some others, because of all that work he did outside of that. But he fought top level opposition. Tony Canzoneri has not only fought and beat when at Ace counts of Hall of Famers at 9, he's nearly in double figures. He's nearly into that exclusive club where Ray Robinson and Armstrong and McLaren and Greb, who've actually beaten double figures of Hall of Famers. He had 23 fights against Hall of Famers, and he beat 15 individual champions. Now, people, again, nowadays may not think that's a lot, but all the original divisions were not there. And also, aside from NSAC NBA issues here or there, you know, there were less champions per division, but he still had well over 30 fights against champions, fighting nearly 400 rounds against them. This is a vastly experienced fighter, Tony Canzoneri. And when you actually look at his career and you see the kind of fighters he beat, not only talking about Charles Bud Taylor's and later losing fighters like Kid Berg, Sammy Mandel, but he also beat, to me, one of the greatest super featherweights of all time, Benny Bass. Okay, he also fought fighters like Billy Patrol, Sammy Fuller. You know, he knocked out Jack Kid Berg with one of the most brutal shots, you know, you can picture, if that's the fight I'm thinking of. I mean, he hit him with a counter shot and Jack Kid Berg just fell like a tree. You know, we're talking about Jack Kid Berg, who had 4 defeats in over 90 fights. Tony Canzoneri wiped him, okay, you know, for world lightweight and light welterweight titles. You know, he beat Jack Kid Berg in the rematch. He also beat the Cuban Bonbon, Kid Chocolate, who had less than 5 defeats in over 70 fights. And when you actually, you know, look at who he fought, you know, even including the losses to Jadick for light welterweight title, he also beat the Express Billy Patrol, another sensational fighter, another outstanding lightweight fighter, and even beat former, you know, version champions like Battling Shaw, losing to Barney Ross, winning and losing to the great Jimmy McLaren himself, beating good contenders like Cleto Locatelli, you know, Frankie Click, of course, who was super featherweight champion a number of times. So when you look at his overall resume, Tony Canzoneri, to me, is one of the greatest fighters of all time, period. He's actually rated inside my top 10 fighters of all time. And to get into my top 10 fighters of all time, you have to have a resume that is staggering. You have to have title accomplishments that are generally staggering. You know, you have to have a career like that. And Tony Canzoneri does have a career like that. You know, pound for pound rated in my all-time ratings for many years. You know, and when you fight those kind of names, the Hermika Hurricane and all these other fighters he fought, McLarnings and everybody, Charles Bud Taylor trilogy. Charles Bud Taylor, of course, denied McLaren becoming a bantamweight champion. Otherwise, he would have gone on to be probably more than likely a 4-weight world champion. Of course, Canzoneri beat him later in a non-title fight. But, you know, Tony Canzoneri is a great fighter. I would have had him higher, but number 5, he has to settle because a lot of his work was outside the division.
Yes, very well said, very well reasoned. I struggle with the same thing because I also have Canzoneri, for whatever it's worth, inside my top 10 all time. And he's an almost immeasurably great fighter. And his level of opposition is absolutely insane. across several divisions. So the question is like, how great was the lightweight body of work? Because overall, I mean, I think he had, what is it, about, I think he had 175 fights. He has 141 wins overall, 10 draws against 24 losses, 43 knockouts, not a big knockout puncher, but 21 wins, if I'm not mistaken, 21 wins over men who were champions, future, former, current. 12 wins over Hall of Famers. Again, not all at lightweight, but he was there enough at lightweight that you got to have Tony Canzoneri on the list. Because his overall resume, I think from your stat video, BL, he had 84 fights against guys who were top 10, 63 wins. 63
that's
wins.
86. 86 plus 64 wins.
Oh,
He also
86
had
to 60.
22 world title fights, which at that time is an enormous number. 22 world title fights.
Absolutely stunning. So from what I thought, unless I miswrote it, is it 35 top 3 wins? 35 wins?
What, against
So
top 3 fighters? Yeah, it's 35 wins. He had over 50 fights against top 3 rated fighters. 18 fights
35.
against ring champions.
Incredible. And you just look at his resume, and it's like the more I study boxing history, especially these very rich, busy eras, it's absolutely stunning. Bud Taylor and Bass and Dundee and Rudis, Chick Suggs, Glick and Singer, Jack Kid Berg,
Yeah, the
Kid
names
Chocolate,
are outstanding.
Frankie Click, Wesley Ramey, Petroli, Baby Arizmendi, Lou Ambers, Jimmy McLarnin. I mean, he mixed in the absolute highest company, and because he's split across divisions, he doesn't rate higher. But as far as, because we have no criteria, I absolutely couldn't put him any lower than this. And even this, it was going to be 4 or 5. But it turned into this, and so we're going to move it forward now, cruising down toward the crucial last couple. I'm pretty sure I know who they are, but we'll see. Scrapbook, would you like to present your, I believe, number 4, sir?
Absolutely. My number 4 is going to be Tony Canzoneri. And it's ironic how you guys explain. Hold on one second, guys. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm in a bad location right now. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, and my apologies too. I think I left Duran's picture up while I talked about Canzoneri.
Yeah, I noticed that. I knew I would be talking about him, and you'll put him up soon, so I didn't mention it. But Tony Canzoneri, the reason why I have him above Roberto Duran, because Roberto Duran did great work at lightweight, and he did what he was supposed to do at lightweight. But the thing is, when you look at it from an overall picture, he lost to the man that he should have defeated in order for him to be rated where he needed to be rated, as far as I'm concerned. He lost to Tommy. He lost, although he split a victory with Ray Leonard, but then he would lose to Ray Leonard in the fashion in which he did. He would lose to another very, very good fighter, the Radar, Wilfred Benitez. He lost to Marvelous Marvin Hagler. So when you put him, even though that's not lightweight, but when you put him in the role of great fighters, I have to give Tony Canzoneri ahead of him because of the names you just mentioned, the Archie Bells and Sonny Smith and Georgie Max and Davey Abad, Rinke Serrato. These are great fighters. Arnie Rauches, Bushy Graham.
California, wow, Davey Abad, yeah, Davey Abad, top level fighter.
An unbelievable fighter. California Joe Lynch. There was a fighter by the name of Herman Perklick. He had a twin brother. He's very underrated. You have Pete Cerramento and Frankie Wallace, Johnny Dundee, the Scotch Rock, Inicio Fernandez, Charles Bud Taylor, Pete Nebo, Benny Bass, Harry Blickman. Harry Blickman was out of Philadelphia, another underrated fighter. Bobby Garcia, Chick Suggs, Al Singer, December 14th, 1928. He was in a ring with Eddie Anderson when he won a featherweight championship crown. He was in a ring with Joey Singal and Armando Santiago, Johnny Farr, and Jackie Kid Berg, Joe Glick, and Sammy Mandel. When he knocked out Al Singer, that's what did it for me. Because a lot of people don't know Al Singer was a very, very good fighter. The problem was he couldn't get past the way Tony Canzoneri would bounce around with his hands down. He would feint you, look up, and shoot punches straight across the shoulders. And he got him with a beautiful straight right hand. And that really did it for me. But he was in a ring with Kid Chocolate and Johnny Jadek. And oh, my God. Leo Litelli. He was in there with Leo Roddick and Bobby Pancho, Lou Ambers, Eddie Zivic, Barney Ross, Battling Shaw, Baby Arizmendi, Jimmy McLaurin, and Leo Roddick. when you look at names like that, that is what a fighter does. And so that's the reason why I put him ahead of Roberto Duran. I mean, it doesn't matter, but that's why I did, because of that reason. But that was a great selection, BL. But I just want to say that with Tony Canzanelli, I think he's a little underrated, more so than he should be, with a lot of those casuals out there, because of what he's done and the time in which he came. Remember, it was right after the Depression. 29 stock market crashed. And that's when Tony Canzanelli, he was really doing his good work. So I have to give him a lot of credit. Great fighter was Tony Canzanelli. Outstanding fighter.
No, I've got to say, Random, before we go on. Yeah, way Scrapbooks put that to me there. That's really made me think, actually, on this Canzanelli Duran thing. I'm going to leave them where they are for now. But yeah, thanks for that, Scrapbook, because it's always hard to rate fighters who fight across multiple divisions in a division. But yeah, you've made some good points there. I'm going to mull on that and think about that. But yeah, what you pointed out there is quite powerful, and yeah, I'm definitely going to have a good think about that going forwards for sure.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
Yeah, that was very cool. All right, BL, it's on you. Yes, sir.
My number 4, is it?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
All right. My number 4, okay, is Ike Williams. Ike Williams is my number 4. Yeah, Scrapbook's really got me thinking. My brain's cogitating everything he said and formulating. Right, I'll go with what I've got for a minute. Ike Williams is my number 4. Ike Williams, to me, is one of the hardest punching, most powerful lightweight fighters of all time. People who say that Ike Williams couldn't compete with Duran, you are thinking silly. Ike Williams would stand there and fight with anybody. He had the power and the strength, the physicality. Anybody who saw his tooth get damaged and the ferocious assault he put on that man to batter him was incredible. When referee wouldn't stop in, Ike Williams called him referee, and he wouldn't. So he's like, oh, bang, 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 bang. I'll keep going. He was an outstanding fighter, one of the most powerful lightweight fighters of all time, and a great puncher. And Ike Williams, to me, I've seen lightweight top 10s that don't even have him in, and I'm like, what are these people rating on? They have Diego Corrales in, but not Ike Williams. He only ever lost one title fight. When you're talking about fighters who've mixed in good company and they've got a title record, a defined title record, and they've only ever had one title fight loss, in nearly a dozen world title fights, that shows kind of quality. And Ike Williams himself, when you actually think about his CV and who he fought, he also fought a who's who, top fighters of his time. One of his early opponents, Luther Slugger White, one of the toughest lightweight contenders of his time, a handful for anybody. And all the way through his career, from beating Sammy Ango, beating another very, very underrated fighter who Scrapbook will know all about, Freddie Dawson. Freddie Dawson was a super tough fighter. Ike Williams beat him. He also won and lost to Willie Joyce, a fighter who Scrapbook rates in his top 10. Okay, he also beat excellent fighters like, Maxi Berger, Gene Burton, another really, really good fighter. He beat Johnny Bratton. He lost to the clutch Sammy Ango. So when you're looking down his career from, Eddie Giosas, beating Tippy Larkin by knockout, beating the Bobcat, Bob Montgomery, by stoppage. Okay, he was an outstanding fighter, all around. And, the fight series with Kid Gavilan, beating another very underrated contender for world lightweight title, Enrique Bolanos, a fighter I've raved about for some time, that he deserves a lot more credit because he was an outstanding fighter, Enrique Bolanos. And you go all through Ike Williams' career and it is just full of talented fighters he fought, a whole number of them. The fights with Bolanos, a number of them were actually fought world lightweight title, as was the fight with Bob Montgomery. So Ike Williams is one of the most powerful. He did fighter at welterweight. He went up to welterweight more in his later career, fought a number of welterweight fights, didn't quite, match that. But he ended on 2 fights with Bojack. He ended his career with a win over Bojack, which is absolutely outrageous considering that by that time he'd had nearly 160 fights. He had over 120 wins and over 60 knockouts. So that is actually incredible. But that resume, from Charlie Salas, losing to George Costner. Ike Williams is my number 4. But I must stress now that I'm really thinking on what Scrapbook said and cogitating. But yeah, Ike Williams is my number 4. A great fighter, and I think that Ike Williams is one of those fighters who could compete in any lightweight era, and at his best, he's going to be a major problem for any lightweight in history, regardless of how good they were.
Yes, sir. Very well said.
Wow.
Yes, I struggled a little bit. I wasn't sure how to order the various things, you know, Duran, Williams, Kanzi. So I ended up going with Ike Williams in this slot too, although I don't know, you're both bringing up such great points. So my shout out goes for this slot goes to Ike Williams, fantastic fighter, and let's just keep it right on moving. Scrapbook.
You can leave Ike Williams right where you have him, Random, because I have him number 4. And BL made so many great points. I mean, it's really amazing how he broke down Ike Williams. I can share a quick story with you if you don't mind. With Ike Williams. Now, see, at that time, a lot of people didn't know about Ike Williams. Now, Ike Williams, he began champion in 1945. He would knock out Juan Jarita in Mexico City in 2 rounds. And he was so disliked in Mexico because everyone loved Juan Jarita that they threw half-eaten sandwiches and soda pop at him. And, you know, he didn't celebrate his victory in the ring. And he wound up going back to the dressing room, all stained up with different juice stains and what have you. And Bojack happened to be in that locker room. And he said to him, "Oh, we got to get it on. We got to get it on." Now, what happened with Bojack and Ike Williams, because Ike Williams was managed by the Philadelphia crime family, Frankie Palermo. He was his manager. So when Ike Williams defeated Bob Montgomery in 1947 to unify the title, they considered Bob Montgomery the champion. They didn't consider Ike Williams the champion in Philadelphia. Why? Because, like I said, Ike Williams was represented by the Philadelphia crime family, and they were trying to nail them at that time. So he didn't get any respect in Philadelphia. So when he fought Bojack in 1948, Bojack was beloved in Philadelphia. And that's the reason why he had a problem, not as a person with Bojack, but that moment in the ring. So when Bojack threw his famous bolo punch and uprooted the right top tooth of Ike Williams took it to him at the end of the 5th round and continued in the 6th round. I spoke with Ike Williams and I spoke to Bojack, both of them. And Ike Williams explained to me that story as to what happened. But Ike Williams was a hell of a fighter, man. He had 8 bouts in 1940. And that's another thing. He began his professional debut with the greatest fighters of all times: Willie Pep, Jimmy Bivens, Ray Robinson, Ezard Charles. They all were professional in 1940. And ironically, they would lose their titles after they began getting their titles in 1951. They all lost their titles in the same year. So one of the most dramatic and saddest years in boxing, as far as I'm concerned, besides 1922. But with Ike Williams, the thing with him, his wars with Enrique Bolanos, who was an outstanding, like BL said, a very Mexican out of California. You know, those are the fights that he had his fights with Enrique Bolanos. And Willie Joyce had 4 fights with him. He only defeated him once. Willie Joyce defeated him 3 times. When he fought Johnny Bratton went 9 rounds with Ike Williams with a broken jaw. Goes to show you what type of fight these men were during that time. But when you look at Ike Williams, the 2-fisted punching machine that he was, and the fighters he was in a ring with, that just goes to show you Gene Bergman, Bob Montgomery, Ralph Zanelli, Enrique Bolanos, Tippy Larkin. Tippy Larkin had fought Bojack for the New York SAC lightweight championship belt. And when you're looking at fighters like Tippy Larkin had 19 main event bouts in Madison Square Garden. Bojack had 21. Ike Williams would come into the middle of this, and he would destruct. Nobody can defeat Ike Williams. So my grandfather, and I'll end with this note, my grandfather knew Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter used to date a girl named Lulu Bell on 106th Street in Harlem, New York. And my grandfather lived on the 6th floor. So when he saw Jimmy Carter, he asked Jimmy Carter, "I need to speak with you." Jimmy Carter doesn't know what he wants. He goes upstairs and he asked him, "Can I get you something to drink?" And Jimmy Carter cleverly said, "No, thank you." So he sits him down and he asks him, I understand you fight like Williams. And he said, yes, I am. He said, no, you don't understand. I got a lot of money riding on this. Because Ike Williams was part of the Philadelphia crime family. And he said, yes, I'm going to knock out Ike Williams. That's all I need to know. So he put a good amount of money on. And when Jimmy Carter knocked out Ike Williams in 14 rounds, it was like Mike Tyson being knocked out by Buster Douglas. A lot of people don't know what it meant at that time. So Ike Williams was a hell of a fighter. And I just wanted to add that before Gil Turner and Johnny Bratton, many great fighters. So an outstanding fighter was Ike Williams. So I have him ranked number 3.
Yeah, wasn't Ike Williams also one of the first, if I don't know if I'm remembering this right, but I'm sure that he was first fighter to deposit Kid Gavilan to the floor in the ring. He was first fighter to knock down Kid Gavilan, I think.
Yeah, I believe you're absolutely right. It was Ike Williams with the Kid Gavilan. Because now another thing, Kid Gavilan is another fighter who John Bratton had fought the same amount of rounds, 9 rounds with a broken jaw with Kid Gavilan. This was after the Ike Williams. So he was around that time when all of those fighters used to fight each other nonstop. There was no problem getting the fights going. They fought in different arenas. And Ike Williams had no problem going to Philadelphia. He was from New Jersey. But yes, he was the first one as far as I can remember. Yeah.
Wow, that's heavy duty. So BL, we've arrived at your number 3. Now a tortured pick, from what I understand.
You are, sorry?
I said somewhat of a tortured pick.
Yeah. My number 3, I'm gonna stick with Roberto Duran there until after live stream, and I'm reconsidering my rating of Canzoneri after that. I'm gonna look into it deeper. But basically, I've always kind of had the same 3 fighters, top 3 lightweights. For now, I'll say. But I put Roberto Duran number 3. One of the reasons why Duran, I do not think I've mentioned this before on live streams and on videos, and in response to Duran fanboys who proclaim his lightweight run is the greatest thing ever in the division's history. It's not. Okay, Roberto Duran's lightweight run is not as great as some of the fighters. He has not beat the level of opposition in his lightweight run that some of the fighters have beat. Yes, he beat, you know, good contenders. He beat Ken Buchanan in what was being a very difficult night for him. You know, Ken Buchanan said, every time I went to take a piss after that fight, I remembered Roberto Duran because of pain, you know, in his crotch area that resulted from that low punch. He said, Duran reminded me multiple times a day of himself for years. He also, you know, lost famously in a non-title fight, and then beat in a title defense Esteban de Jesus, a very good fighter, not an all-time great to me, de Jesus, but a very, very good lightweight fighter. He then beat him in the 3rd fight in his final lightweight defense to become undisputed champion. A lot of people have a misconception that Duran was a dominant lightweight champion. He wasn't. He only held one of the 2 titles right up until his 12th title defense in the trilogy fight against Esteban de Jesus. It's another little misconception that goes around. You know, when Duran fought Sugar Ray Leonard, he only had 1 defeat in over 70 fights, and he had avenged that defeat twice, once in a title defense and once in a undisputed title fight. So the only fighter who would ever beat him in professional ring, he actually beat them twice as well. So when he fought Sugar Ray Leonard, it was coming back not only off the lightweight run, which broke Joe Old Bones Brown's record, even though I don't think he fought as good opposition at lightweight as Joe Brown did. He broke the record to say it at 12 defenses, which were then beaten by someone you've never heard of called Artur Grigorian later. But that's another story. But basically, you know, when he fought Leonard, he had that 1 defeat, eventually twice. It was one of lightweight's greatest punchers, you know, without a shadow of a doubt. Roberto Duran and those quick 2-handed punching assaults at lightweight, he was a brutish fighter. But he was also very clever at coming inside, slipping shots and coming around the jab on inside. Very, very clever fighter. You know, great upper body movement, you know, fast reflexes at lightweight, massive knockout puncher. I just think I could have rated him potentially higher at lightweight had he fought a higher level of opposition in those title fights. And like I say, I'm not saying that he fought weak opponents. He did beat some standout opponents. You know, Buchanan and de Jesus are both fantastic names at lightweight. But the other fighters in there, you know, from Lampkins and all these other fighters, I just don't think are the quality of opposition needed to get him into the top 2 in my top 10 lightweights. But I do give him the credit of giving him top 3 until I do a little reevaluation tomorrow and have a closer look at that again.
Oh, fantastic. You are, as I hoped, doing my work for me here. Yeah, I struggled with the top, everything outside of the top 2, and then the order of the top 2 gave me a couple of headaches. But I ended up going with Duran for number 3. Ridiculous success at lightweight with all the pros, but a truly great fighter and someone who was very underrated technically. So I had to give him a very, very high rating. He couldn't pierce. There are people, of course, who say he's the greatest thing ever, but there are 2 fighters that by process of elimination, I'm pretty confident we all have as the top 2 in some order. And let's just move forward.
Can I just add something else on Duran? There's something I'm really wanting to stress. I just want to list for you his title fight wins, okay, outside of Buchanan and Jesus. They are clearly the best wins he has at lightweight. Does everyone know who Roberto Duran... Right, I'll just reel them off. He beat, in his title defenses, Jimmy Robertson. Okay, Jimmy Robertson. He also beat Hector Thompson. He beat Guts Ishimatsu. He then did beat a good name, okay, Esteban de Jesus. He then beat Masataka Takayama. Okay, he then beat a good contender, Ray Lampkin. Okay, he then beat Leoncio Ortiz. Okay, some of these guys are good contenders, but that is all they are. Alvaro Rojas, who were 21 wins and 10 losses. Okay, he then beat Villamar Fernandez, another good fighter, but not Hall of Fame caliber. He beat the excellent Edwin Virueta, who were a tough handful, and then beat De Jesus in that final fight. Those are the names that Duran beat at lightweight, which to me are not good enough to put him number 1 or number 2, because I get attacked all the time and say, well, how dare you have Duran at 3rd? But it's based on who he beat at lightweight in that title reign. You know, I cannot put him in the top 2. I just wanted to really stress that point. Some of those fighters are really good fighters, Buchanan, De Jesus, and when you go beyond that, some of them are really good contenders, but that's all they are, good contenders, most of them.
That's perfectly logical.
Great breakdown. And can I continue with that one more moment before we get to my next fighter? October 16th, 1972, when he would stop Ken Buchanan in New York's Madison Square Garden. Do you know that Carlos Ortiz had faced Ken Buchanan? Now, Carlos Ortiz was already at that point, he was kind of like on a decline. That was his last fight, Carlos Ortiz with Ken Buchanan. When Roberto Duran fought him, Roberto Duran, as they showed at the clip, as you see, the low blow at the bell, he was given the championship. He had to go for a hearing for that, and he would wind up winning the hearing. It was a big deal before he actually got the belt. June 20th, 1980, when he would win the WBC Welterweight Championship crown and defeated Sugar Ray Leonard. The thing with that situation, when Ray Leonard made all the excuses as to what happened and why and so on and so forth, but it wasn't until the next fight, I had to give Duran credit in the next fight to make sure it was, you know, not so much legitimate or anything, but he had to seal the deal for me, and he kind of froze up when now we're talking welter, we're not talking lightweight, but we're talking his career. When he did the no mas, what that does, especially in the Latin culture, that is very, very disrespectful in terms of their culture. And it took a long time for him to get the respect back from the Latin community until he fought Davey Moore. I was at that fight in New York's Madison Square Garden. It was on his birthday. And he broke Davey Moore down in such a way where Davey Moore tried his very best, but he couldn't anymore, and he got caught with a sneaky punch. And he went down and he was out. But then he would lose to Thomas Hearns. He would lose to Marvin Hagler. He would lose that rematch to Ray Leonard. He would lose to Vinny Panzian. I mean, there were certain victories that he needed to win and to solidify. So when you put him up against a Cantonero and Ike Williams and fighters like that, when you look at those details, it goes to show you where he places. And that's the reason I'm giving him the 3rd number 4. I'm giving him that. But, you know, when you really study it at a sharper, and BL's giving him number 3. that's great credit. But it's a lot of little things that he did when you look historically of fighters with hands and others had to go through. But when you try to put him close like that, you just got to take a second look at it. Roberto Duran was a hell of a fighter. He was a great fighter, hard puncher. But there's little fights that he needed to win in order to solidify who he was during his era in reign. And I think that's why he falls short of Ray Leonard and Thomas Hearns and Hagler and Benitez.
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
it's interesting you say that. They also say he wasn't keen on fighting Antonio Cervantes, but he did also. He has to get good credit. I'm sure you'll agree for destroying Pipino Cuevas and for that ice and fire battle with Carlos Palomino, which is an outstanding fight to watch.
I give him credit for that. Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, I agree with Scrapbook. He was too hot and cold. You know, I've pointed out before that Duran only ever defended. He won titles in 4 weights. He won 5 titles. He only ever defended at lightweight. He never defended at welter, light middle, or middle. He never made a successful title defense outside division. Now, some people have said, well, Ike Williams never won a title outside lightweight. No, that's true. But his level of opposition at lightweight was outstanding. And even when he went up, you know, he were fighting Gavilans, he were fighting Basilios, he were fighting many top-level fighters up there. Even later on in his career, fighting Basilio, which were a very tough fight for anybody at that time. You know, Basilio won and lost to Sugar Ray Robinson, one of them one of the greatest fights ever, a real 15-round brawl. But, you know, he mixed in really good company, and Duran was too hot and cold for me. And I think that's something that Scrapbook touched on. You know, he'd fight great in one fight, and then he'd get outboxed by Kirkland Lang. I remember watching that fight. Duran was subpar. He was just not on form, and that is, I think, a weakness in Duran's career. He could be brilliant 1 minute beating Barkley, fighting off the ropes, clever counter-punching, you know, muffling a lot of Barkley's work, knocking him down in that later round with that left, right combination. You know, great performance. His brutal destruction of Davey Moore, which when you listen, those body shots are making a horrible sound. I mean, he just vandalizes Davey Moore. He beats up on him, comes on inside, mauls him. And then next week, he'll lose to someone who he shouldn't even be losing to. You know, inconsistency in Duran's later career after lightweight is also a bit of an issue, which is why I don't rate him top 10 fighter all time like many people do, or even top 20. You know, I do hold him to account for that that inconsistency.
Well, very good point. I think that's basically what I'm saying, Bill. Great point. You explained it better than I could. And the thing with Carmen Basilio, with the Ike Williams, the only man to knock out Carmen Basilio was Gene Foreman twice. Other than that, nobody else knocked out Carmen Basilio. Carmen Basilio was a very tough fighter. When he fought with I'm thinking of his name now, DeMarco.
Tony DeMarco.
Tony DeMarco. Yeah, Tony DeMarco. Yeah, when he had the 2 fights with Tony DeMarco, those were wars, bloody and ward wars. And he staggered a few times, but he was never knocked out. Gene Foreman was the only man to knock him out. So, you know, you look at all those little things and you compare. Roberto Duran, a very good fighter in his era, a great fighter in his era. But when you look at those little details, that's just I'm speaking of. And you broke it down better. Yeah.
Well said. Now, speaking of the details, we are down to the top 2. I'm pretty sure I know who's in it. Scrap, you get to lead. Which of these 2 great fighters made your number 2 slot?
Tough one, yeah.
My number 2. Drum roll, right? My number 2 is Benny Leonard, Benjamin Lanier, the Ghetto Wizard. And there's reasons for that. Benny Leonard was an outstanding fighter. I mean, my God, what a boxer he was. I saw a film of him when he fought Lou Tendler. And the boxing display that he put on Lou Tendler, who was a southpaw. In fact, he was always rated as the greatest southpaw for many years. Was Lou Tendler. But Benny Leonard was an unbelievable fighter, one of the best scientific fighters that I've ever seen. And that's saying something, you know, outside of the Willie Peps of the world. But he was an outstanding boxer. He feigned with his feet. He moved from side to side. The men he was in the ring with, just incredible. And in 1917, when he won his title, that meant a lot because I had a friend named Teddy. He lived on the Lower East Side on Cherry Street. And that's where a lot of these Jewish fighters had lived. And Ruby Goldstein, who lived on the other building from Teddy, I had a pleasure of speaking with Ruby Goldstein. Benny Leonard was the face of the Lower East Side in those years. You had Benny Boger and you had Sid Terrace and Ruby Goldstein. You had a lot of great Jewish fighters during that time. And when Ruby Goldstein was knocked out in the first round by Sid Terrace at the Polo Grounds, the Jewish community in that area couldn't eat for a week. They closed up the shops, they closed the schools down. It meant that much. So when Benny Leonard left from the Lower East Side, he was the guy that everybody had praised. And when he won in 1917 the title, that was a big deal. For a whole week, they had celebration in the schools, on the job, civil service. I mean, everybody celebrated when Benny Leonard won. And so he meant that much to the community. And he was such a great fighter. I have to rank him number 2 because the man above him, there were so many other things that went on in his boxing career, was just phenomenal. But Benny Leonard, in my opinion, one of the greatest just about the greatest lightweight of all time. I just have one man either tied with him or, above in terms of his career. And we'll know who that is in a moment. But Benny Leonard is a phenomenal fighter. I have ranked number 2.
All right,
Yeah,
BL.
Scrapbook. Yeah, thank you, Random. Yeah, I'll give my number 2 in a second. But yeah, Benny Leonard, Scrapbook. 2 things I want to give a shout out to Benny Leonard just to back Scrapbook up there. Is point 1. He received a lot of criticism for fighting a black fighter, former colored lightweight champion Leo Johnson.
Yes.
One thing I respect about Benny Leonard in that time, because a lot of people think Benny Leonard marginalized black fighters, but actually Benny Leonard's attitude was not that at all. It's a misconception about him. When he was criticized quite widely and quite nastily in some quarters for fighting a black fighter for world lightweight title in his first defense, Benny Leonard's response was, "This is sport, and in sport competition, anybody deserves a chance." And I think that is a great testament to him, that he ignored the fact that Leo Johnson was a black fighter, and to him, it was not about race, it was about the competition. He was fighting a former colored lightweight champion, and he wanted to fight him. Great credit there. Another thing that Scrapbook touched on was the fight with Lou Tendler, the fight where Tendler hit him with a left hook from hell. Lou Tendler, like Scrapbook said, was rated for decades as the greatest southpaw ever. Now some people say Pacquiao, etc., etc. But Lou Tender at lightweight and welterweight was an outstanding fighter. Now, they had a few fights, and in one of those fights, Tendler caught him with an outrageous left hook, and it landed bang on the chin. And Benny Leonard actually said he felt his legs turn to jelly underneath him, to a point where he daren't move. Because if he moved his foot or tried to reposition, he knew his legs would go and he'd fall over. So he actually said after the fight, "I had to think quick. So I realized I couldn't move, so I started talking to Tendler because he hadn't realized how much he'd hurt me." So Benny Leonard started talking to him like, "Oh, is that the best you've got, Lou?" Blah, blah, whatever he said. And Lou Tendler, being a fiery little battler, he couldn't resist talking back. Now, Benny Leonard said, "I did that to distract him while my legs recovered." So he got hit, thought, "Oh, I can't move." And in his mind, he thought, "I'll talk to him." So he started talking to him in ring. And Lou Tendler couldn't resist talking back, and they had a little two-way conversation. But over that 5 to 10 seconds, Benny Leonard's legs had recovered, and he could get on his bike. I mean, that is what you call real ring IQ. People talk about ring IQ as counter-punching ability. To talk about ring IQ about positioning. But that quick-minded thinking, when you're hurt, then you realize you can't move or your legs will go. To think to distract your opponent by starting to mouth off at them in ring, to get into a little engagement which distracts them from following up and finishing you off. That is real ring IQ to me. That is a demonstration of a really, really intelligent fighter. So yeah, I just wanted to mention those few points on the Great Ghetto Wizard. But my number 2, me and Scrap have them reversed. And I still argue these two to this day. I still argue these two to this day. My number 2 is actually the old master, Joe Gans. One of the greatest lightweight records of all time. Okay, one of the greatest lightweight records of all time. Multi-year world champion. Lost to Langford in 1903, but no real disgrace there. Langford's my number 1 fighter of all time. Joe Gans, from fighting Bobby Dobbs, who Scrapbook has brought up, the multi-set fight series with the tough and capable George Elbows McFadden, who was called an overly dirty fighter. He wasn't quite as dirty as some people make him out to be. A bit like Mysterious Billy Smith. He could be a really dirty fighter, but at other times he wasn't that dirty. But he just got painted with that brush every single fight, regardless. After that, he was just known. But when you can fight Dave Holly's, Sam Langford's, Jack Blackburn's, battling Nelson's, terrible Terry McGovern's, Jimmy Britt's, when you can fight in a manner that you are so clever, because a lot of people don't realize on Joe Gans that how cerebral he was. Just give me a second. Yeah, sorry about that. They don't realize how cerebral he was. That he would position you. This is, again, a bit touching on Benny Leonard, and both of these guys have massive ring IQs for boxing. So Gans would be in middle of the ring. He'd position his left foot and move. Okay, so his opponent would think, oh, he's moving. He'd counter. And then he'd follow with another move, then another move, then another move. The opponent would kind of counter what he was doing, and then the big shot came. The opponent didn't even realize that he was maneuvering him into position using double or triple feints, so that the opponent would get himself into a position where Gans could deliver a big shot and knock him out. Real cerebral fighter. So to me, for Joe Gans, it's not only the great resume from the Ruth Turners and the Brits I've mentioned, and the Hollies and Blackburns and Langfords and Walcotts and all the other Sam Boland, all these other outrageously good fighters he fought, and the great title record he had, and the 100 knockouts, and the career were really very few defeats, really. His career really didn't have that many defeats at all, considering he had such a huge career. He only had 10 losses, okay, nearly 180 fights. And considering that level of opposition, when you knock off losses to Langford, he didn't really lose to many weak opponents at all. A lot of those defeats are to top level fighters, Langford, McGovern. He lost twice later to battling Nelson, after earlier beating battling Nelson pretty much with his jab. I mean, he was snapping Nelson's head back. He was timing that jab to perfection, and battling Nelson in that 42-round fight was taking an absolute shellacking from Joe Gans's jab. Joe Gans, with that incredible boxing IQ, the ability to use double, triple feints to set opponents up to knock them out with single hard shots, is one of the great lightweight punchers of all time. Someone come to me with another lightweight who's got 100 knockouts and a decorated title fight record and a decorated resume with many great fighters top to bottom. Great fighters from pretty much, he even fought some fighters who were from bantamweight, fought fighters up to middleweight. I mean, this guy fought a who's who of the great fighters of his time. He fought two best fighters of his time period, Langford and Barbados Demon Joe Walcott. And when you add all the other fighters in there to that title record, to his ring IQ, you're looking, I think, at one of the most complete fighters of all time, because he had the power, he had the endurance, he had the speed, he had the ring IQ. Okay, he's got the resume, he's got the title record. He's an all-rounder, a complete all-rounder. Truly legitimate all-time great, Joe Gans, and quite worthily, even now, still massively respected by many boxing fans now, as he deserves to be. So yeah, I have Joe Gans number 2, but I could easily put him number 1. I'll just add.
Yeah, I struggle with this myself. I'm still struggling, but I'm gonna go with what I came into the conversation with. For my number 2 lightweight of all time, I have the great Benny Leonard. And for years, when I was a casual, it was just a name, because I was like, Sugar Ray Leonard, no, that's a great fighter. And I'd see these old school boxing cats on these documentaries and things talk about the great Benny Leonard, and I was like, who is this guy? When I've looked a little bit more into it, and he has an absolutely stunning career. He wasn't a big knockout guy. I think he only had about 28 knockouts. And although 4 of them were in fights against Hall of Famers, so that's actually That's pretty epic, you know, as far as like getting it on when it counted. But this man has 16, if I'm not mistaken, BL, this man has 16 wins against Hall of Fame opponents. 16. That is top tier. There aren't that many fighters of that. There really aren't.
Yeah, that's
16
right.
is
He
top.
beat 7 Hall of Famers in total. Yeah.
Because I think, and let me think, who's tied for that? 16 is, it's Archie Moore, I think, has 16. And is it McLaren has 16? I'm trying to remember.
Oh, you've got me there. To be honest, I'm not 100%
Is it
sure.
McLaren has
I,
13,
I think
individual, 15 total. I 16 total.
McLaren, I think he has 15. No,
So let's
16.
see. Let's see. So the top is Harry Greb, then Sam Langford, then the great Ezra Charles, then Sugar
No,
Ray
it's actually
Robinson
Harry
third.
Greb, then
Then
Jimmy McLaren. McLaren beat 13 Hall of Famers. Oh, you're
individuals, yeah.
talking about total
Total
wins.
wins. Yeah, because
Oh,
16
right.
is
Yeah,
right up
yeah,
there. It's way up
yeah, yeah,
there.
yeah.
I think only maybe he's tied with Moore, and I think it might be McLaren, but only Harry Wills, uh, Ezra Charles, Sugar Ray
Yeah,
Robinson,
Sugar Ray
Sam Langford, and
Robinson,
Harry
Greb, and
Greb have
Langford.
more.
Yeah.
He's in that tier just below the guys who are just on some stratospheric like number. But so just to get a sense of how many times he got the best against the absolute all-time great fighters, and just the names on his resume, you know, Rocky Kansas and Dundee and Freddie Welsh and Kilbane, Jack Britton, Ted Kid Lewis, Willie Ritchie, Soldier Barfield, Charlie White, all these guys he's fighting, just this complete insanity. The reason he didn't swipe the number one is the finishes, but that's not really putting anything against him. I mean, he's one of the greatest fighters of all time. I'd comfortably put him inside my top 20, probably my top 15. I'm just not sure exactly where. I'm still arguing myself about that. After several years of looking through this, when I try to make an all-time list, it depends on how I'm feeling that day. I'm sure you guys have been through this for decades. It
Yeah,
happens.
yeah. He did
oh
have a
yeah.
lot of knockouts, though. He actually had 70 knockouts random, Benny Leonard.
I wonder. Oh, You know what it was? I'm sorry, I misread it. It was 28 knockouts in 3 rounds or less. Oh, that's a little different. It's still below the number one for knockouts, but that's a lot more than I just glanced down. My fault. Yeah,
Yeah,
70
yeah, it's all good,
knockouts,
mate. Yeah,
28,
he were a
28
good
in three
puncher.
rounds or less. Yeah, and even like later when he came back as a welterweight, he was winning until he met the great Jimmy McLaren, who was just naturally younger and brilliant himself. So, but as a lightweight, Benny Leonard, just an absolute all-time great fighter, as well as in strictly within the lightweight division. Just it's hard to find anyone above him. I only found one person above him. But let's go to Scrapbook Boxing's number one lightweight of all time, sir.
My number one is Joe Gans, old master Joseph Gans. And the reason why I have him number one is because of the time that he came and what he had to go through. He threw so many fights that he could have won because of the time that he came and who he was and so on and so forth. But the men he was in the ring with, the Bobby Dobbs of the world, he was in the ring with Kentucky Roseburg. A lot of people, they underestimate him. He was in the ring with Spike Sullivan, William Spike Sullivan, Herman Miller. You had a lot of names that obviously are not strong names to the person that doesn't do quite close research, but they had a lot of things going for them. Dale Hawkins, and I'm trying to think at the top of my head, yeah, George Elmo McFadden, he was in the ring with him several times. But the thing with Birdlegs Collins, the thing with Joe Gans, when he invented the jab and the 1-2 combination punch, the foot placement as he threw punches, the ability to parry and to move his head at the same time as he's throwing a punch. A lot of things were new to that time period. And Benny Leonard learned a lot from that. Benny Leonard is on record saying that he respects Joe Gans so much that he respects Joe Gans. He feels Joe Gans is a better lightweight than him. But Joe Gans taught Jack Blackburn. He taught Jack Johnson. He taught a lot of these men how to do certain things at that time that they didn't know how to do. And he's just underrated because it's so many dives that he took. When you look at his record, he could have won probably about 99% of his fights had he been treated fairly. Remember the time that he came around. So when he fought Terry McGovern and the battling Nelsons, there was so many things going on in his head that he wasn't supposed to win. He wasn't supposed to go so many rounds. I mean, 45 rounds in Goldfield. You know, there's just so many things about his career that is so misunderstood and taken for granted as to how great of a fighter he really, really was. It's really a shame, but Joe Gans was such a great fighter. You know, the last years of his life when Jack Johnson was facing the Boilermaker Jim Jeffries in 1910 in Nevada, he was there. He was there along with Sam Langford, along with Bob Armstrong and Joe Jeanette, Joe Walcott. They were all there. But Gans couldn't stay because he was sick. He was dying at the time. So they sent him back on the train. They wouldn't let him on the train. Walcott pulled some strings and got him on the train. So he got on the train, and 2 weeks later, he would die in Baltimore in his home. He was such a great fighter. And I have him ranked #1. I just think the time that he came, I mean, the victories and the knockouts of Steve Crosby and a lot of these names that you really don't hear a lot of, it just underrates him a lot. But he was a great, great fighter. I just have him #1. And with Benny Leonard, he states that he feels that Joe Gans was better than him, you know, in terms of the abilities that he had. And all those fighters learned from him. So I have Joe Gans ranked #1 as the greatest lightweight of all time. It's just in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd like to say, a fighter. Scrapbook mentioned there, Steve Crosby. Yeah, what a hell of a fighter he was. You know, and again, it's kind of Scrapbook's really alluded to a point I think I mentioned earlier. When people look at these records, they don't understand who a lot of these fighters were. But you know, Sam Boland, Steve Crosby, you know, Spike Sullivan. You know, many of these guys were major league fighters, really, really tough fighters in the time. You know, I always shout out a fighter called Charlie McKeever. He was an outstanding fighter in that time. You know, so many fighters around that time are quite unknown. And like Scrapbook pointed out there, you know, you have to do heavy research. You've got to look through these fighters' records to start to gain an idea of the opposition that a Gans or someone else fought. You know, you really need to look at the opponents. I did a live stream a number of years ago, because people are saying, well, why is I can't remember who it was on, but it was someone. So I brought up Canzoneri on the live stream, and I said, right, when we click down this guy's opponents, who are his opponents beating? And then I went to Canzoneri, and I was like, right, who are his opponents beating? Oh, this opponent beat multiple Hall of Fame fighters. This opponent was a 4-year champion. This guy beat 25 top 10 rated fighters. This guy beat 12 world champions, 5 Hall of Famers, 6 Hall of Famers. You know, so you've really got to look at who the opponents were, kind of like what Scrapbook alluded to. But yeah, I've always had a massive respect for Joe Gans. Like I said, a truly great breakdown, Scrap, and I love the shout outs of people like, you know, Steve Crosby and Sullivan and all these people. They were really tough fighters.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that, and that's what it is. I think when people look at them in detailed fashion, they're going to find so much more information that they didn't know before. And that's what's important about going back and really breaking down the opponents of the fighters that they fought, because it tells you a lot about the fighter that they're fighting and the time in which they came and things they couldn't get away with. They couldn't decide what ring and what size and what glove and where this is going to happen. Joe Gans was in so many fights where the police interfered, where he was scheduled to fight one fighter and they would change their mind when he got there. He fought Dave Holly in 1903, and 300 miles later, in 24 hours, he had faced Sam Langford in Connecticut. And these are just a tip of the iceberg of things that they had to go through and deal with. So that time was just something else, man. Amazing fighters during that time. I appreciate all of them. But Joe Gans, I just happen to have him #1 because I look at it from that perspective. Neither answer is right or wrong, you know, but I just look at it from that perspective, what he went through and the things that he had to deal with. And the men that he was around, all the Joe Gans, the Barbados Demon, the Jack Johnson, the guys like Joe Jeanette, and Sam McVay, that whole era, it's just amazing. It's just amazing of what they went through. But he was an outstanding fighter, man, and I just appreciate him that much. That's all.
Yeah, for sure.
Great shout.
Agreed.
Yeah, this is all debatable. We're talking about some of the finest pugilists that ever lived, not just to the lightweight division. When we get up to this top here, we're just talking about these incredible athletes. So, BL, you're number one. I think we can say who it is. Go off on this guy, this great, great fighter.
Yeah, my number one, and again, I'll stress, like I mentioned earlier, my number one and number two are interchangeable. On any given day, I could swap them around. My number one I'll pick is actually a fighter who regarded Joe Gans as his idol. Okay, Benny Leonard. He so respected Joe Gans, it was insane. I remember reading an old newspaper interview with him. I think it was in 1920. They did an interview with Joe Gans, Benny Leonard, sorry, and the praise he had for Joe Gans was amazing. He respected him as a fighter for his skills, for how he conducted himself as a champion. Benny Leonard had a massive respect for Joe Gans, and like Scrapbook said, Joe Gans had to do with a lot. The Ghetto Wizard himself was actually one of the great lightweight punchers. Now, his career may not show that, and you may not recognize that, because he did have a massive career of over 200 fights, and people say he only had 70 KOs. But he did score 70 knockouts, okay, in 89 official wins. He only had 6 defeats. He had over 200 fights. He only, lost a small number of fights in his entire career. And for me, when you look at Benny Leonard, it's simply a fact of, he had 27 fights against champions. That is a huge number. And 26 fights against Hall of Famers, beating 7. And he only ever lost one title fight. Okay, he only lost one title fight in 11. So just like Ike Williams and certain other fighters, they don't lose virtually any title fights. Benny Leonard made 9 title defenses. Okay, that was for the lightweight title. He reigned as champion from 1917 to 1925, one of the longest lineal lightweight reigns in boxing history. And he was a great champion with a great boxing IQ. And you look down his ledger of the fighters he's beaten, Rocky Kansas, a very underrated lightweight Hall of Famer. Freddie Welch, the Welsh Wizard, Johnny Kilbane. These are fighters he's beaten. Rocky Kansas, Freddie Welch, Johnny Kilbane. Jack Britton, the boxing marvel, one of my top 10 fighters of all time. Johnny Dundee, okay, another fighter who's massively held in regard by myself as one of the greatest fighters of all time. Willie Ritchie, Lou Tendler, Charlie White, Lockport, Jimmy Duffy, Soldier Barfield, losing to McLarnin. He has a great record, okay? You think about that. Small number of defeats in over 200 fights, considering opposition he fought with that IQ, one of the great lightweight punchers and one of the longest lineal lightweight reigns of all time. I have Benny Leonard number one, but him and Joe Gans always have a special place to me when people talk about lightweights and great fighters in general. Both of them are very highly rated in my all-time rankings in my top 1,000. Both of them inside the top 40. And inside my top 40, it's a heavy bunch. So any fighter even to get into my top 40 on my countdown, you've done really well to get into that top 40. So yeah, for the moment, I put Benny Leonard number one.
Fantastic. That's a great tribute, BL. So yeah, I struggle with this, but I already named Leonard my number two. There's arguments for both statistically and also like stylistically, and the strengths of their eras. They were both in incredibly rich eras around their weight. And but for my number one, I did end up going with the old master, Joe Gans. And this man had a stunning career. And one of the things that stood out to me, because I've been studying your pound for pound ratings, BL, so he was inside the top 10 fighters in the sport 9 years in an era,
right, yeah.
In an era when, unless you're certain guys like Gans and Langford and like certain exceptional all-time great talents, possibly Walcott, Barbados Walcott, the original Joe Walcott, staying up there near the top for that long is unheard of. And he was pound for pound number 3 for 5 years.
Yeah, and pound for pound number 1 for 3 years. Yeah.
Pound for pound number 1 for 3 years. So you're talking about a generational great, and also one of the most influential boxers of all time. Like, he was in a rich era, and a lot of people were paying attention to what he was doing. and he was fighting a tremendous schedule with tremendous success.
Well, yeah, if I
And
may, in my pound ratings all time, he was pound number one in the decade 1900-1910. That has fighters like Langford, Walcott, Jack Johnson, Jeffries, all those Ketchel, all those great fighters. He was pound number one a third of that decade virtually, considering all those great fighters like you alluded to.
it's absolutely stunning. His longest win streak, 42 fights, which I believe was the one that was ended by Blackburn in a shorter fight. And then not long after, the great Sam Langford got the best of him. But he had fought the very powerful Dave Hawley the night before and then rode on the train.
Mhm.
People said he took him lightly, but whether he took him lightly or not, he still fought Langford. And I read the reports. That was a hard fight against Dave Hawley. So Joe Gans was made of steel. He would set these elaborate traps. He was a thinking fighter. Sam Langford considered him the best all-round fighter ever. He just said he just never gave anything away. He had no tells. He showed no emotion. He had no tells in the ring. The
Yeah,
great
and
Ben.
in that fight, that 15-round loss to Langford, in two of those rounds, Gans nearly had Langford out of there. He had him in bad trouble. He set him up and caught him. And Langford said those punches were hard. I think it would it in fourth round and 10th round, or fourth round and 11th round, but twice Gans set him up. And Langford said he had to think in that fight because he knew that if he made any big mistakes, Gans were going to knock him out.
Yeah, and there's one. I can't remember who it was he knocked out, but one of the pieces of footage of him online, and the guy throws, I think, a cross, and he jabs the armpit to push him off balance and finishes him with the right hand. It's like he basically jabs him in the armpit to put him off balance, to like plant the guy's weight where he wants it and then line him up for the big shot. Like just, the other great fighters where they're setting you up for the big shot that's devastating. Gans was one of those, even though he was a little guy. He was willing
He
to
was
fight
also
larger
good.
men.
He was also good at reading your upper body movement, and he'd pull back from punches and just hit you with straight counters and knock you out. It really did. I mean, against pound fighters in my database, he only lost 9 of those fights out of 36. I mean, that is against top level pound rated fighters, a huge winning record against them. And considering
That's
who many
right.
of those pounders were, Blackburn, Holly, Langford, Walcott, Nelson, McGovern, to have a severe winning record against that level of opposition is quite a testament to him.
Absolutely. And, in 1904, he fought Barbados Walcott. And Barbados Walcott accidentally shot himself in the hand afterwards. He was out of action for a couple of years, else maybe they would have had it last minute became a non-title fight, but they fought 20 rounds to a draw, and so while he was the champion, so that's a real super fight. That's two like all-time greats, Barbados Walcott, Joe Gans fighting each other. This was a very rich time for boxing. They had a lot of really big fights happening, and the names on his resume, not all of them are equally famous, but some of these guys are very formidable. Although some for a shorter span of time, like we're saying, it's hard. Like he had 147 wins, but if you count the newspaper decisions, he had 160 times he came best, 21 draws total with the newspaper decisions, and 12 losses. Like I think that's 193 fights that are known, and who knows how many that aren't on the books. But it's just, he beat 6 undisputed champs, if I'm not mistaken, BL. But the names: Kid McPartland, Elbows McFadden, Spike Sullivan, Young Griffo, Bobby Dobbs, Roof Turner, Dave Hawley, Jack Blackburn, Jimmy Britt, Mike Twin Sullivan, Steve Crosby, Sam Boland battling Nelson. He is fighting a who's who. And like you said, 36 fights against men who appeared in your pound for pound ratings. And your pound for pound rating is brutal. So it's not fighting and you see who does slightly more than the other guys. There's insane years going on year to year in these pound rankings. They can be quite volatile sometimes. That level of consistency to make the top 10 9 years is astounding. To be top 3 5 years is phenomenal. And 3 years at pound for pound number one in that era. I'm not sure, BL, but there can't be too many fighters who hit pound for pound number one 3 or more years in that kind of schedule, the era of those live gate eras.
No,
Remarkable.
there is really not many who've accomplished that. Muhammad Ali, another fighter who were pound number one for 3 years, were Manny Pacquiao, a more recent champion. But not many have done it. Not many have done it at all, really.
It's really hard, especially if you're matched tough. And he fought a furious schedule. and was matched tough overall. He had some easier fights, but a close inspection on those is sometimes he's a smaller man, or sometimes there's a side bet. So he undertakes. There's something that would happen with mismatches in this day. Some guys would do this to get more fights, more bets. They would undertake to stop a fighter within a certain amount of rounds. So you think to beat a great fighter is tough, but to last a certain amount of rounds is easier than beating a great fighter, because we see it in boxing and in fights in general today. Sometimes someone's overmatched, so they run, and it's closer than it would be if they weighed it in. Gans was able to beat guys who literally were just trying. They could win the bulk of the purse by just staying in there, and so some of those happened above his weight. He fought in private. There were quite often side bets. He was just an immeasurably influential in his day and a really celebrated fighter, enough that the people who saw him and saw Benny Leonard and saw the different generations in the years and decades where the schedules were furiously busy often, a lot of people still have him right up there near or at the top, including, and if you're getting vouched for by Benny Leonard and Sam Langford, who themselves are all-time great fighters, that does mean a lot. It's not definitive, but that edged it for me. Benny Leonard tipped it from Benny Leonard to Joe Gans by just basically saying he's the man. But you can also be, people say that being gracious, just wanted to give respect, keep someone's name alive. But certainly those two fighters and everyone on these lists, these are all just fantastic fighters with rich careers. And there were some great fighters that didn't even make any of our lists. It's just so many. And there was a question earlier from 86 Boxing asking if Battling Nelson would have made our top 20.
Unknown. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure he'd make it into my top 20. Possibly.
I'm not sure myself, but that's an interesting question. 86. I think it was 86 in the chat.
I did actually, I did actually have a check random just while you were on talking about the 3 years pound number one. I opened my pound ratings file up and we're looking at the listings for pound number one. And at the moment, I've only found 3 fighters in boxing history who've beaten that total. One is Muhammad Ali at 4 years. Another is Floyd Mayweather at 4 years, and then Emil Griffith at 4 years. So that'd mean that Gans is tied 4th all time in most years pound number one rated, with a number of fighters who also, there's about another 5 or 6 fighters who were pound number one rated for 3 years. But that's against some testament, all time, all fighters, all divisions.
Yeah, and also factoring in how many times a year this great fighter was competing. Some of the, like, say Floyd being pound for pound, he's fighting at a high level. He's fighting very high level, but he's not having a lot of fights there. And Gans was one of those fighters, Benny Leonard as well, where their year-to-year schedule, they're fighting seasons. And then when they recap in the papers at the end of the year, their name just comes up again and again and again all over the place. That's one of the certain fighters. They're very busy. Not everyone stays busy, but you looking through the archives and see the fight bookings and results week to week or day to day. Some of these guys, they just keep showing up, and you can see how they're a big star because you're literally seeing them fight all the time. It seems like every week there's some news about an upcoming fight, and for some of these guys, every 2 weeks, there's results from a fight, or every 3 weeks. Just a magical time that he was so potent in. And now there's one other thing I wanted to do. I sent out some feelers for some lists. I only got one list back. Rodolfo, one of our great supporters. Yeah, Rodolfo. He submitted a list. I forgot who was on it, so I'm going to read it. I was going to format something. I ran out of time because I was roasting on the beach, and it was hard to see the phone. So I just screenshotted his message. I'm sure he doesn't mind. So Rodolfo, his list contains Benny Leonard at number 1, Great Joe Gans number 2, Roberto Duran, Tony Canzoneri, Ike Williams, Carlos Ortiz, rest in peace, Freddie Welsh, Lou Ambers, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., not Jr., and Pernell Whitaker. So, wow, that's a good list. What's some great fighters on there?
Yeah, can I actually, I mentioned earlier, I don't know if Scrapbook wants to add anyone else, but I just want to do a little shout out as well to some of the fighters, because I found this list a very tough one. And I want to say, aside from the 10 I've named there, I want to bring up Pernell Whitaker, who I think was so talented, he probably could have outboxed a number of people on my list. Bo Jack, a fantastic fighter, you know, exciting, attacking kind of fighter. Bojack, all those Madison Square Garden nights, indeed. You look at other fighters, Dave Holly, okay, Adwalgas battling Nelson, who was mentioned, Jack Batlin. Great Packy McFarland, okay, who doesn't have a resume to match some of those guys on there, but he was still an outstanding fighter himself. Lou Amblers, Tenderler, Rocky Kansas, another fighter who never won a title, okay, who beat 5 Hall of Famers. Wesley Ramey, another very unsung lightweight fighter. The Bobcat, okay, the great Bobcat, Bob Montgomery. You know, Jimmy Carter, who kind of has the mob ties, partially putting a question mark against him, but many fighters do. The outstanding Billy Patrol, okay, the Express, very, very dangerous fighter indeed. And other unsung fighters, you know, fantastic Puerto Rican fighter like Pedro Montanez. You go through lightweight history, there's just so many names there. Another fighter I rate, a great Mexican fighter, Rodolfo Casanova. People don't realize he beat 5 Hall of Fame fighters. You look at other good fighters like Ishmael Laguna. To me, lightweight has been one of the divisions that has been hardest for me for the sheer names, you know, along with Barney Ross, Lou Ambers, all these names I had to leave out. It would have very tough top 10 to do. I'm glad we've been able to get through it and we've done it, but yeah, that would have tough top 10. And when we do the featherweights, that's going to be a tough one as well, I'm afraid. It's not going to get any easier.
Great breakdown, PL. That was, I'm sorry, man. I just wanted to congratulate BL on that. That was a great point. I just want to, can I mention one thing if you don't mind? It's on topic. 1922, and we'll talk about a show with some of the years of great fights, but 1922, we talk about Benny Leonard, and that's why I'm bringing up 1922. It was one of the most upsetting years outside of 1951 in boxing. George Compartier would lose his title to Balansiki, who would become the first black light heavyweight champion of all time. Gene Tunney would lose his America's light heavyweight championship title to Harry Greb. Theodore Tiger Flowers would be knocked out in 2 rounds by Sam Langford. Jack Britton. Now, the thing with Benny Leonard, had he not hit Jack Britton while he was down, he could have, because he was winning all the rounds, could have possibly became the welterweight champion of the world. Wouldn't it be interesting if Benny Leonard faced Mickey Walker, because Jack Britton's next opponent was Mickey Walker? If
that's
Benny
right, and Britton lost, yeah.
For that title, how interesting would that have been? And what do you think would have happened? That's what upsets me with Benny Leonard, because he could have then become the welterweight champion. No doubt about it, I would have put him over Gans, but then he would have faced Mickey Walker. That is the premier fight that you can have when you have a master boxer coming up from almost like a Roberto Duran coming up to fight Ray Leonard, where you had these two men who were the greatest in their era, with Mickey Walker as welterweight and Benny Leonard as lightweight, coming up as he defeated Britton, the boxing marble, now taking on Mickey Walker. Wouldn't that have been fascinating? What do you think that outcome would have been? My God.
Oh, Mickey Walker and Benny Leonard, my goodness, the Bull and the Matador. The Bull and the Matador.
Yeah, man, we missed that because of that foul. But and the thing is with Benny Leonard, look at all the fights he fought in 1922 when he would knock out Rocky Kansas. I mean, you look at the years. That's why I would say you go back into the time in which the man came. But we missed out on some good fights because of reasons. But I would have loved to have seen that fight. Oh, maybe we'll do a fantasy.
I do actually think that Mickey Walker at that time, he beat Britton, didn't he, to become welterweight champion, like you pointed out. And he went on to reign for like nearly 3.5 years as welterweight champion. Yes. But he was still quite young in his career at that point. I think Benny Leonard probably would have outpointed him. I think Benny Leonard at that point he was in his prime. He was in his middle of his lightweight reign. He was still at prime of his powers. And I think for a Mickey Walker that young, still developing, even though he beat Britton, Britain by that point was an older Jack Britain. This one, Jack Britain from 1914 to 1918, having all those great battles with great Kid Lewis, amongst many other fighters. Britain was getting a long in tooth, even though he fought on well past 1922. He was still fighting top 10 contenders into late 20s. He's such a great fighter, Jack Britain. But I just think at that time, Scrapbook, I think Benny Leonard would have had too much. He'd have been too clever, too experienced and clever for Mickey Walker, and I think he would have outpointed him. But it would have been a rough night because Mickey Walker literally was rightly named the Bulldog. He's like an earlier version of a Marcel Sedan. Powerful hooker, bore into you, push you back, just try and weigh you down and batter you down. He would have a very strong fighter at welterweight. Many people talk about him as a middleweight, but they don't realise how bull strong he was at welterweight. And how powerful he was at welterweight. But I just think Benny Leonard had too much IQ, too clever a fighter in ring. He'd have used his distance, his movement, and I think he'd have outfoxed and nullified a lot of Mickey Walker's early aggression. I think Benny Leonard would have took a point win, but it would have been a tough fight.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I just think it would be a great fight. But yeah, I believe that Leonard would take him. It would have been a great fight. Just missed out on that because of the foul. Oh man, 22 was something else. Love 1922.
Yeah, absolutely. So, gentlemen, are we going to try and plan on air now what our next one is going to be? We talked about a couple of options backstage. Do you want to plan it now or do it behind the scenes?
Whichever you guys decide. I mean, the greatest years would be great. We talked about possibly top 5 greatest fights. We talked. There's so many options. So whatever you guys would want to choose, I'm all for it.
Yeah, let us know in the chat, folks. Because I was thinking, okay, so we could do the 5 greatest fights of all time each. Maybe even we've been wanting to have 86 on. Maybe that's something he could join us for. That would make for 20 total fights.
Yeah,
Josh, what do you think, man? Would you join us for that? Do you guys think that's plausible?
I think it'd be good to get 86 on to join us.
Get 86 on. I think you're outnumbered, 86. I think you've been drafted.
Yep.
So start getting your thing ready. You're going to have to send me the list. So on GRF 1205, so that's a great... Sorry, go ahead.
I am attracted by my personal 5 greatest fights. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of that, and there's no criteria 86, so it's literally just the fights that give you that best feeling. We're going all in the feels because I know that's the fights I'm going to talk about. They're not necessarily what I think are the greatest objective fights. They're just the ones that I watch a lot. I have certain fights I watch. I've seen certain fights over 50 times, just a few. So I'm going to talk about those fights and why I get endless entertainment from them. Oh, he's already on it. 86 already on it. Yeah, I love these chats. I can't thank you two enough for joining me. And 86, thanks for coming on the channel, brother, and just talking. I was talking to Rodolfo about maybe having him on. I just like to have a talk with some of the regulars here. Just talk. All I really care about is music and martial arts. So one of those 2 subjects.
Well,
but yeah,
I would like
so we'll plan it.
I would definitely like to thank you, Random, for hosting this latest great live stream. It's a bit shorter than his normal ones, but we did start a bit later. I would definitely like to thank Scrapbook Boxing, as always. Great insights, and he's really got me thinking on this Canzonero Duran thing. I'm an Ike Williams Duran. I'm really going to have to look at that again.
Make it a live
for my
stream.
Permanent, historical rankings, in my opinion, not my automated ones. But yeah, I'm really going to have to look at that again.
Go on live. Just reason it out on air. We'd all love to listen to that. I'm sure.
Yeah, so thank you, gents, and look forward to 86 joining us for this more fun 5 greatest fights. I'm fascinated by that. I've already got them jumping in my mind. What will be in my top 5? Yeah, fantastic. So
yeah, I love it. Are we thinking possibly doing it in 2 weeks? That's been our general schedule. Is that possible, guys?
Yeah, I'd be
for me. It's up to BL, so it looks like it's possible for me.
Yeah. 2 weeks from now. Let me just think off my head. Next week is then. Yeah, 2 weeks will be fine. Yeah, I'm free.
Great. 86. Hopefully you can join us for that. We'll certainly find a date that we can all do it. But if you're still with us, Let
I
us
will
know if you
send
can
you
do.
my list random before the date. I will send you it over next. Give it a week while I really want to have a good think about it. I've got to
Yeah,
think
yeah,
about. I'll send you my list.
yeah. It works for 86. So we're on. So two Saturdays from now, 4 p.m. Eastern time. Everyone's got to
Cool,
send me the
cool.
list, but you don't have to send it to me in order. So there's some surprise, but I want to have graphics ready. And obviously, if we're now talking about top 5 lists of just every fight that ever happened, that's a lot of fights. I'm not going to
I
make 300,000 graphics.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you guys agree, but as well as doing this other separate one, I would like to also crack on in future lives with these divisions because too many people ignore bantamweight, flyweight, and featherweight. And I'm keen for if you two guys are up for it to venture down there and keep going with these as well over time.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
To make sure we don't leave any of. And we haven't done the heavyweights. We've done the heavyweights 1900, 1925. That'd be another interesting one, but.
it's time
Yeah,
to do 1926 when we could start on 1925 to 1950.
or we could do what we've done for others and just do a top 10 all time.
Yo, I'm ready for the heavyweights. That's my favorite division in fight sports. Boxing, both.
But if we do featherweights next as a division, that'd be great because I really want to shout some of my featherweights out. I'm sure Scrapbook
So,
does as well. And
Oh,
so let's
absolutely.
loosely plan. How about we'll loosely plan for roughly 2 weeks after this next one, and we'll do the featherweights next for the
yeah, that's
three-person
good.
panel.
That sounds good by me. If it's good by Scrap and yourself.
So a month
Great.
from
So,
now, we'll do the featherweight. Sure.
yeah, that's, and if anything changes, we'll reschedule it. But I'll go ahead and put it up for 4 weeks from now, and then I'll put up the video for the top 5 fighters. And to the regulars here and listeners afterwards, if you want to, when I do put the link up on my channel, if you want to throw your top 5 list, I'll read it out on air, or maybe even just like type it up or something. One last thing I wanted to do is Rodolfo sent some shout outs as well. He had his top 10. So I want to shout out his shout outs. Battling
Absolutely.
Nelson, Arguello, and I think that's Armstrong. Hammering Hank.
Mm.
Hammer
Good
and hand.
stuff.
Oh,
Thanks for participating, Rodolfo. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much, my guests, and thank you, Josh, for agreeing to participate in our next panel discussion. Oh, shout out Nick, and also shout out Martin. That was his question earlier. I attributed it to Josh to 86. So yeah, good question, Martin. I don't know if Nelson would make my top 20. I don't know enough. I don't even like my own top 10. I'm still arguing myself. So I'm gonna maybe listen to the show back at some point, make a new top 10. Yeah, you have a
all right.
great weekend too. Well,
I
I'm
want
gonna
to shout
go
out to
because
Nick
I'm.
Hammer and 86 Boxing as well as Adolfo. And I can't see the list, but I know they're in the audience, and I just want to thank them for their time and always supporting me as well. I do appreciate it always.
Yes, sir. And Martin,
Something?
how are
I
you?
cannot see Rodolfo's comments at all.
Martin Dunson, yeah, absolutely.
Rodolfo was on the original stream. I wonder if he made it over to this one or if he's on the playback crew.
Oh,
He might be on the playback crew, or it might be that he didn't catch that we were gonna start a new link up. I'll send him the link anyway. I'll DM him the link. No problem. Well, that's about it for us because I'm off to work now. This has been fantastic. Thank you again, everybody. And look for that 2 weeks from now. We're going to be doing each of our top 5 greatest fights of all time. That's going to be epic.
Oh,
fascinating.
Awesome. We're going to call it. Have a great day, everybody.
take care. Have a good one.
Take care.